There is something quietly extraordinary about the idea of crawling underground and sealing a door behind you, cutting yourself off from everything you have ever known, and trusting that the world above will still be worth returning to someday. It is a powerful image, and in the world of Fallout, it is the beating heart of one of gaming's most layered, most haunting, and most deeply human pieces of storytelling ever constructed. The vaults. Those enormous steel doors. Those humming corridors lit in pale yellow-green. The smell of recycled air and government-issue soap, and something just slightly off. Something that the brochures never mentioned. We are going to spend a long time down here together, moving through these stories slowly, no rush, no urgency, just the quiet unfolding of what happened inside these places when the bombs fell and the doors sealed and the people inside realized, one by one, that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Some of these stories are chilling. Some are deeply sad. Some are almost funny in their absurdity before they become something else entirely. All of them are worth knowing. So get comfortable, settle in, let your breathing slow. This is a long journey through concrete and steel and the long, dark decades of what Vault-Tec built in secret. Part 1. The Promise and the Lie. Vault-Tec's Grand Deception. Picture the advertisements. Bright colors, cheerful music, the Vault Boy grinning his round-cheeked grin with a thumbs up that says everything is going to be fine. The billboards across pre-war America promised safety. They promised community, stability, a place where the best of civilization could be preserved until the danger passed. Vault-Tec sold the vaults to the American government and the American public as the most ambitious civil defense program in history. A network of underground cities, each capable of housing around 1,000 people, buried deep enough to survive a nuclear exchange, stocked with enough food, water, and medical supplies to sustain a population for decades. It was a beautiful lie. Not because the vaults were not real. They were built, most of them at least, and they did protect people from the bombs that fell on the 23rd of October 2077. The Great War lasted approximately 2 hours, during which the accumulated firepower of a century of resource conflicts was released across the surface of the Earth, and when it was over, the people inside the sealed vault doors were, physically speaking, alive. That part worked as advertised. What was not advertised was the rest of it. Vault-Tec, working in close cooperation with an organization called the Enclave, a shadow continuation of the United States federal government, had an entirely different agenda running beneath the surface of the shelter program. The vaults were not primarily intended to save people. They were laboratories. And the people inside them were the subjects. The original design philosophy, which was later confirmed by Fallout series co-creator Tim Kaine in a video he released explaining the lore he and Leonard Boyarsky originally conceived, was tied to something even larger than the nuclear war itself. The Enclave had looked at the state of the world, the resource wars burning through the Middle East, the new plague, the steady collapse of the global ecosystem, and drawn a conclusion. Earth was not going to be habitable for long, even after the bombs. Their plan was to leave. To build a starship and escape to another solar system, carrying the best possible cross-section of humanity and start over somewhere new. But interstellar travel presents problems that no civilization had ever solved in a practical sense. How do you keep people alive for years, possibly generations, in an enclosed metal vessel with limited resources? How do you maintain social cohesion under extreme psychological pressure? How do you prevent the kind of catastrophic group behavior that would doom a colony ship before it ever reached its destination? You would need data. Real data from real human populations, under real conditions of scarcity, isolation, stress, and confined living. That is what the vaults were really for. Each vault, with a handful of exceptions, was given a specific experimental parameter. One variable changed from the baseline. One stress introduced into the population. One element altered to see what would happen over months, years, decades. The people inside had no idea. They had signed up for a shelter, they got a petri dish. Of the 122 vaults eventually constructed under Project Safehouse, only 17 were control vaults, meaning they operated essentially as promised, with no embedded experiment. But even those control vaults existed not out of any compassion for their inhabitants. They were controls in the scientific sense. Baseline comparisons. Without a control, the experimental data from the other 105 vaults would have no reference point. The 17 functioning vaults existed to make the cruelty of the other 105 look meaningful on a chart. The Enclave monitored all of them, from their oil rig off the California coast, later from various outposts across the wasteland. They watched the data come in. They could communicate with vault computers remotely. They could override systems. In at least one case, they sent an all-clear signal to Vault 8, prompting its inhabitants to emerge and found what would eventually become the city of Vault City. In another case, they kept a vault sealed long past any reasonable point, extending the experiment simply because the data was still coming in. The inhabitants were never told. They never knew they were being watched. The overseers, the appointed managers of each vault, were in on it to varying degrees. Some overseers were Vault Tech employees who knew exactly what they were doing and executed their experimental parameters faithfully, even with enthusiasm. Some were ordinary people given authority and a hidden directive they may not have fully understood. Some went rogue, abandoning the experiment entirely to protect their people. And some became something far worse than what Vault Tech had planned. Because when you give a person total authority over a sealed population with no oversight and no accountability, sometimes what emerges is not a scientist. Sometimes what emerges is something much simpler and much older: a tyrant. The architecture of a vault tells you something about the philosophy behind it. Every vault is built to the same general specification: circular doors, numbered corridors, atrium spaces, dormitories, cafeterias, medical bays, the overseer's office sitting behind a heavy door at the end of a hall. The uniformity is deliberate. The baseline had to be consistent so that the variables could be isolated. But within that template, Vault Tech installed whatever the experiment required: extra weapons, extra drugs, cloning equipment, virtual reality pods, white noise generators, a single man's puppet collection. The contents of the vault told you exactly what Vault Tech was testing, if you knew how to read them. The terminals tell the rest of the story. Scattered across every accessible vault in every Fallout game, the terminal entries are the diary of the experiment logged by overseers, by scientists, by ordinary dwellers who noticed something was wrong and wrote it down before the worst happened. Players who read these carefully enough get to watch the slow unraveling of a community in real time, one dated log entry at a time. A scientist noting a slight behavioral change in the population. An overseer reassuring their superiors that everything is under control. A dweller writing about how they cannot sleep, cannot stop thinking about the noises in the vents. By the time you understand what you are reading, the ending has already happened. You are walking through the aftermath, piecing together what was done to these people from the evidence they left behind. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most sophisticated uses of environmental storytelling in the history of the medium. And it all begins with a promise on a billboard and a cheerful cartoon character with a permanent smile. The vaults were a lie told with such extraordinary thoroughness and such enormous expense that the lie itself became a kind of monument. And the people who believed it paid with everything. Before we go any further into individual vault stories, it is worth sitting with that for a moment. The scale of what was done here. Thousands of people, across dozens of locations, sealed underground on the word of a corporation that had already decided they were experimental subjects. Families, children, teachers, musicians, athletes, engineers, farmers, doctors, people who had paid their money and done what they were told and trusted that the great machine of civilization would keep them safe, and the great machine used them for data. Take a breath, let that settle. Because now we are going to walk through the doors, one by one, and see what happened inside. Part 2. Vault 11. The Annual Sacrifice. The Mojave Wasteland is a quiet place in the early hours of the morning. The sun has not yet risen over the ridgeline to the east, and the desert holds its chill from the night before. In the central east portion of the wasteland, south of the New Vegas Medical Clinic, and not far from the NCR Correctional Facility, there is a vault entrance half buried in a rocky hillside. The door is sealed. The surrounding area is empty. A loading screen hint, if you happen to see it, simply says, Vault 11 has been abandoned for decades, though few people know the story of its terrible past. That is an understatement of almost staggering proportions. Vault 11 was designed by Eric Fenstermaker, with the original concept created by Joshua Sawyer, and its central inspiration drawn from a 1,948 short story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery. If you have read The Lottery, you already know something about where this is going. If you have not, The short version is this. A small town holds an annual lottery, and the winner is stoned to death by their neighbors. The story is about the way communities perform violence when tradition and social pressure make the violence feel like something other than what it is. The way ordinary people become instruments of cruelty, not because they are cruel by nature, but because the structure around them demands it, and they cannot find the will to refuse. Vault-Tec took that premise and ran it forward for 75 years. The experiment parameters for Vault 11 were brutally simple. When the vault sealed and the population settled in, the vault's computer system announced a directive. Every year, the dwellers were required to sacrifice one of their own. If they complied, the vault would continue to function normally. If they refused, the vault's life support systems would be shut down, killing everyone inside. This was a lie. The entire threat was fabricated. There was no mechanism to actually shut down life support. The vault computer was never going to kill anyone who was not selected, but the dwellers did not know that. They had no way of knowing that. And so, for 75 years, they complied. What makes Vault 11 so devastating to sit with is not simply the fact of what happened, but the extraordinary detail with which the terminal logs document how it happened. Because the vault's inhabitants did not simply pick someone at random, they built a system. They held elections. Every year, the population voted for an overseer, and at the end of that overseer's term, the overseer was taken to the sacrificial chamber and killed. The vault's governing structure was transformed into a death sentence, with a 1-year reprieve for whoever won. And people campaigned for the position. That is the part that takes a moment to fully absorb. In the early years, there were actual political movements within Vault 11, organized voting blocks competing for control. 6 factions emerged the coalition of Vault, 11 voting blocks, and they maneuvered and negotiated and built coalitions. But the object of the game was to get someone else selected as overseer, not yourself. To be politically powerful enough to deflect the sacrifice onto someone from a different faction, to be indispensable enough that the collective would keep choosing someone more expendable. The overseer elections became the central drama of life in Vault 11. The terminal logs capture it in fragments, each entry a small window into a social ecosystem that had been thoroughly warped by the annual requirement of violence. There are logs from political operatives explaining their strategy. There are logs from people who were elected and who knew what was coming. There are logs from ordinary dwellers who watched their neighbors go to the chamber and did not know how to process what they had participated in. One of the most striking entries belongs to a man who served as the ombudsman for the elections, a neutral figure meant to ensure fairness in the process. In his terminal entry, he writes about his fundamental confusion at what Vault 11 requires of them. He wonders whether there is a purpose to any of it, whether the sacrifices mean anything, whether the people who comply are demonstrating something noble about their capacity for collective survival, or something shameful about their willingness to destroy each other one person at a time in order to protect themselves. He does not reach a conclusion. He just asks the question, and then the entry ends. Over the decades, the social fabric of Vault 11 deteriorated in the way that prolonged collective trauma always does. The initial political structures gave way to cruder forms of influence. Violence became a more direct tool. A group called the Missionary Bloc gained power not through persuasion but through intimidation. There were murders conducted outside the formal sacrifice mechanism, people killed not because they had been selected by the Vault, but because they represented a threat to someone's power. A woman named Catherine Stone is mentioned in the terminal logs as one of the more significant figures of Vault 11's later history. Her husband was killed to prevent him from exposing a corrupt arrangement within the governing council. In response, Catherine went to the council and offered herself as the next sacrifice, not because she wanted to die, but because it was the one form of currency she had left. She traded her life for a guarantee that the people responsible for her husband's death would face consequences. The logs do not tell us exactly what happened in the immediate aftermath of that, but they tell us enough to understand the shape of what Vault 11 had become by its later decades. A place where life was denominated in political units, where the fundamental horror of what the Vault required had become so normalized that it structured every relationship, every ambition, every act of loyalty or betrayal. The sacrifice was not just an annual event anymore. It was the entire grammar of how people related to each other. Then something changed. Late in the Vault's history by this point, the population had dwindled from its original numbers to just a handful of survivors. 5 people made a decision. The details of exactly who they were and what brought them to this moment are not fully documented in the terminals, but the outcome is clear. They refused. For the first time in 75 years, the inhabitants of Vault 11 looked at the annual directive from the Vault computer and collectively said no. When the refusal was registered, the Vault computer played a recording. Not the death sentence the dwellers had feared for 3/4 of a century. Something else entirely. The recording commended them. Vault Tech congratulated the residents of Vault 11 for demonstrating that their commitment to human life is a shining example to us all. It informed them that no one would be killed. It told them they were free to leave the vault and enter the wasteland. The vault doors opened for the first time in decades. Of the 5 people who had made the refusal, 4 walked to the atrium and took their own lives. This is the detail that stays with you long after you have left Vault 11 and moved on to somewhere else. Not the 75 years of sanctioned killing. Not the political machinations or the corruption or the terminal logs cataloging the slow moral erosion of a community. But those 4 people, standing in the atrium with the vault door open behind them for the first time in their lives, who could not carry what they knew anymore. Who had spent years, maybe their entire adult lives, participating in a system that killed 1 person every year. Who had complied and voted and gone on with their lives afterward, and now knew that all of it had been a test, a lie, a performance of cruelty conducted for the benefit of an audience they would never meet. The 5th person left. Where they went is not recorded. What they carried with them we can imagine. The courier, the player character of Fallout, New Vegas, arrives at Vault 11 long after this is over. The vault is empty. The mole rats have moved in. The political posters are still on the walls. The sacrificial chamber still sits at the end of its long hallway. A chair, a coffee table, a projector screen. If you sit in the chair, the Happy Trails slideshow starts playing, congratulating the person seated for their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the community. And then the walls open, and the defense robots come out, and you have to fight your way out. But the real experience of Vault 11 is the terminals. Sitting in the overseer's office and reading entries dated years apart, watching the changes in tone and vocabulary and desperation. It is one of the best pieces of writing in the entire Fallout series, maybe in all of the games that came out of that era. A complete story told entirely through documents and debris, and a room at the end of a hall that still smells faintly of whatever the vault used to clean its floors. The designers who built it gave it something that very few video game environments achieve, a moral weight that accumulates with every new thing you read, so that by the time you find the final logs, you are not just processing information, you are grieving. Vault 11 stands as Vault-Tech's most sustained experiment in the limits of obedience. How long will people do something they know is wrong if the authority demanding it is sufficiently absolute and the consequences of refusal are sufficiently terrifying? The answer, in Vault 11, is 75 years. And the 5 people who finally said enough apparently could not forgive themselves for it. Part 3. Vault 77 One Man and a Crate of Puppets. Not every Vault story ends with a philosophical confrontation with the nature of collective guilt. Some end with a man talking to a Vault Boy puppet on a rope who may or may not have committed a murder in the middle of the night. Vault 77 is a different kind of story. It was documented not in the games themselves, but in a promotional webcomic called One Man and a Crate of Puppets, released in 2008 to coincide with the launch of Fallout 3. The comic was written by Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik of Penny Arcade, working alongside Fallout 3's lead designer, and it stands as one of the more unusual pieces of official Fallout lore, both because of its format and because of how genuinely strange the story it tells actually is. The experiment parameter for Vault 77 was this: one man, sealed in a vault, with a crate of puppets. That is the entirety of what Vault-Tech specified. One resident. A crate labeled P13X, U.S. government issue puppet ration. Whatever data they hope to gather from this arrangement regarding isolation, regarding the human need for social interaction, regarding what happens to a mind when it is given only artificial companionship as an outlet, they built the vault for one person and sent exactly one person into it when the door sealed on the 23rd of October, 2077. The man's name is never given. He becomes known in the comics simply as the Puppet Man. And his story is one of the more genuinely moving things in the Fallout universe once you sit with it long enough. The first hours of his vault experience are recorded in the same kind of terminal log format familiar from other vaults. He banged on the door. He shouted. He was certain this was a mistake, that the other residents were coming, that someone would answer. Nobody answered. The door did not open. The vault hummed around him, all its systems functioning exactly as designed for a population of one. He did not find the puppet crate immediately. For the first several months, the logs document a man doing what any person would do in that situation, trying to maintain structure, trying to stay busy, trying to keep himself oriented in time when every day looks exactly like the last one. The 23rd of March, 2078. 5 months after sealing, he sat in front of the door and cried. He had not touched the puppets. He was not ready to admit that the puppets were all he had. The 4th of February 2079, over a year after the door sealed, he finally opened the crate. He pulled out 2 of the puppets, a dog and a king, and started playing with them. It reads, "In the terminal," like something between relief and surrender. He needed something. This was something. Over the following weeks, the puppets accumulated names and personalities. The king became the king. The dog became Reverend Hound, who served as both the sheriff of whatever story the puppet man was telling and the vault's part-time reverend. A grandmother puppet appeared. And then there was the Vault Boy puppet, the grinning mascot of Vault Tech, rendered in cloth and stuffing, who appeared last and was somehow different from the others. The Vault Boy puppet talked to him. This is the part of the story that is genuinely difficult to categorize. Whether you read what follows as a descent into psychosis, or as something that can only really be understood by a person who has been alone long enough to know what loneliness does to the edges of consciousness, the outcome is the same. The Puppet Man and the Vault Boy developed a relationship unlike anything the other puppets offered. The Vault Boy was not fully under his control. The Vault Boy had opinions that surprised him. On the night of the 30th of March 2079, roughly 16 months after sealing the king, was found dead. His cloth body torn apart in what the Puppet Man could only process as a murder. He accused the Vault Boy. The Vault Boy, in the only way the Puppet Man's fractured mind could allow, denied it. And then the Vault Boy suggested something that the Puppet Man found so alarming that it made him afraid of what the dog puppet might do if it learned the truth. He left. He gathered up the Vault Boy puppet, and he walked out into the wasteland. A man who had been alone for over a year with only government-issued puppet companions, who had just fled his own vault to escape a murder investigation that existed only in his own mind. What makes this story something more than a piece of dark comedy is what happens next, and what you can find in Fallout 3 if you know where to look. In Paradise Falls, the slaver camp southeast of Minefield, there is a holotape sitting near a Vault 77 jumpsuit. The tape's audio log is a message from one of the slavers, explaining why the jumpsuit freaks the boys out. There is a story, passed around among the slavers, about a stranger who came through the area some time ago. Someone wearing that jumpsuit. The slavers will not say what he did, only that they would rather not be holding his clothes if he came back looking for them. A man who spent over a year alone with puppets, who left his vault to escape a puppet murder, who wandered into one of the most dangerous human habitats in the capital wasteland, and made the slavers at Paradise Falls nervous enough that his empty jumpsuit scared them years later. Whatever the Puppet Man did out there in the wasteland, it was enough that hardened criminals who dealt in human lives were relieved to see the back of him. There is something in the Vault 77 story that is almost philosophical in its sideways way. Vault Tech presumably designed this experiment to study the effects of complete social isolation on a human subject. What they got instead was a man who found his own solution to the problem of loneliness, who built a society from cloth and stuffing, because the need for social connection is deep enough in human beings that it will work with whatever material is available, and who then experienced the full range of social complexity, conflict, betrayal, fear, judgment, within a company of hand puppets before deciding he needed to go somewhere else. The data Vault Tech collected from Vault 77, whatever it was, cannot have been what they expected. The Puppet Man story also has a small presence in the actual game world of Fallout 3, in a way that most players never noticed. The Vault 77 jumpsuit in Paradise Falls is listed as a unique item, with slightly different stats from a standard Vault jumpsuit. The slavers treat it with a kind of superstitious dread that the audio log only partially explains. For a game that was running thousands of lines of dialogue and dozens of major questlines simultaneously, this is an extraordinarily small Easter egg, a piece of cloth on the floor of a slaver camp, with a holotape beside it that quietly implies an entire mythology built around one confused, isolated man and the puppet he brought with him when he left. Part 4. Vault 112. Tranquility Lane and the Virtual Sadist. Deep in the Commonwealth of pre-war America, buried under a car dealership in a suburb outside Washington, D.C., there was a vault that operated on a different principle from most of the others. It was not testing what happened when you changed the population's diet, or gave them too many weapons, or split them into competing factions, or took away their ability to leave. It was testing something older and stranger. What happens when you give one person total, absolute, unaccountable power over the internal reality of an entire community? The answer is Vault 112, and the answer is profoundly disturbing. The vault was built to house 85 people, all of them connected to a network of egg-shaped pods called Tranquility Loungers, devices capable of projecting an immersive virtual reality environment so complete that residents inside them could live out entire lives without ever being aware they were in a simulation. Food, sleep, social interaction, the passage of time, all of it handled by the program, all of it artificial, all of it indistinguishable from genuine experience as long as the system kept running. On the surface, this sounds like a reasonable, even compassionate design for a vault experiment. Give people a perfect simulated world to inhabit while the actual world recovers from nuclear war. Let them live comfortably in something that feels like a quiet American suburb. Give them back their lawns and their neighbors and their sense of a normal day. The problem was Dr. Stanislaus Braun. Braun was the director of the Societal Preservation Program within Vault-Tec, and he was the architect of the Tranquility Lane simulation installed in Vault 112. He had designed the virtual world himself, complete with a failsafe that made it impossible for any resident within it to leave voluntarily. And he had given himself administrative privileges that set him apart from all the other inhabitants. While they experienced the simulation as ordinary participants, Braun operated within it as something close to a god. He could change the rules. He could alter the environment. He could determine what people experienced, what they believed, how they felt. He could kill them. Not permanently, not at first. Braun discovered early on that killing a resident within the simulation simply ejected them from that particular narrative, a jarring, unpleasant experience, and that he could reset their memory afterward, returning them to the simulation without knowledge of what had happened. They would simply continue their virtual lives, unaware of the interruption. So Braun killed them, and brought them back, and killed them again in different ways, for different reasons, for the experience of watching it, for the pleasure of having done something irreversible to someone who could not stop him, and then returning them to ignorance so he could do it again. For nearly 200 years after the Great War, while the actual world above the vault collapsed and rebuilt and collapsed again, Braun sat in the simulation dressed as a little girl named Betty and tormented the 84 people in his care. He could not kill them permanently. Not because he lacked the ability, the administrative controls certainly existed, but because of a much more immediate problem. If he killed them, he would be alone. And being alone in Tranquility Lane, having constructed this entire false world, having spent decades in it, having made it his home in the only real sense he had left, that was apparently the one outcome Braun could not accept. The simulation he had designed for Vault 112 was called Tranquility Lane, and it presented itself as a quiet American suburb from the 1950s, the retro-futurist aesthetic that the entire Fallout universe draws from. Picket fences, ranch-style houses, a cul-de-sac with a gazebo, children playing, neighbors waving from their front porches. Everything normal, everything pleasant, everything exactly as it appeared in the government promotional materials for the American way of life. But the people living in it had been there for 200 years. They did not know that. Their memories reset, their sense of time smoothed over. They simply existed in a perpetual present that Braun could reshape at will. A family would have a pleasant dinner together. Someone would die in an accident. Everyone would attend a funeral. The next day, somehow, the dead neighbor would be back on their porch, waving as if nothing had happened, their memory of their own death scrubbed clean. By the time the lone wanderer arrives in Fallout 3 and enters Vault 112, the surface narrative of Tranquility Lane is almost surreal in its mundanity. It is a suburb. People are going about their day. A little girl named Betty is standing near the gazebo with an expression that manages to be simultaneously cheerful and deeply wrong. Betty Braun takes an immediate interest in the newcomer, gives them a series of tasks. Each task is a cruelty designed for someone else's suffering. The quests in Tranquility Lane are some of the most morally uncomfortable in the game, not because they ask you to do obviously terrible things in obvious ways, but because they ask you to participate in what has been, for 200 years, Braun's private hobby. The task is always the same: cause suffering, make someone cry, make someone's life worse. Give Braun the experience of watching a new participant in his game. There is a hidden element to this quest, a failsafe built into Tranquility Lane by someone other than Braun, someone with a conscience, who could not simply eliminate what was happening but could at least provide an exit. If you find the right combination of objects in the simulation and activate them in the correct sequence, a radio near the abandoned house plays the ink spots and unlocks an override terminal. This terminal gives you the ability to execute a fail-safe program that kills all the simulation's residents, simultaneously ends them all in the simulation permanently, releasing their physical bodies from the pods. It is presented as a mercy, and in context, given what they have endured, given that they will never know freedom in any meaningful sense even if removed from the simulation, given that they will emerge into a world 200 years removed from anything they understood it might be. The game does not tell you it is the right choice. It simply offers it. The other option is to do what Braun wants, follow his instructions, cause the suffering he requests until he agrees to let the lone wanderer's father go free, which is why the wanderer entered the vault in the first place. Neither option is clean. That is the point. Braun himself, in the physical world, is a man in a pod, a body that has been connected to its machine for 2 centuries, sustained by the vault's systems. Its brain still ticking over inside the simulation while its flesh has aged past any reasonable reckoning with time. He cannot be reasoned with. He cannot be freed without killing him. He cannot be left without accepting that he will continue doing what he has been doing for 200 years, for however many years the vault systems keep running. Vault 112 is a story about what happens when power is given without any mechanism of accountability. Braun was never monitored by anyone above him. The vault's own systems were designed to serve him. The residents had no recourse, and whatever Vault-Tec had hoped to learn from this arrangement about social behavior in virtual environments, about long-term psychological sustainability in simulated communities, what they actually created was a closed loop of suffering from which there was no internal escape. The fact that Vault 112's experiment was designed around a man who was already exhibiting the kind of behavioral profile that should have disqualified him from this level of authority suggests either that Vault-Tec did not do thorough psychological screening of its vault overseers, or that they knew exactly what they were getting with Braun and considered it acceptable. Given everything else Vault-Tec was willing to accept, the second option is difficult to rule out. What lingers about Vault 112, long after you leave it, is the mundanity of the suffering. The suburb, the picket fences, the neighbors who have been neighbors for so long that they cannot remember a time before this. A little girl skipping near the gazebo, wearing the mind of a man who has been hurting people for 200 years because he can, and because he is afraid of being alone. Nothing about Tranquility Lane looks like a horror. It looks like a nice neighborhood on a quiet afternoon. The horror is entirely in what you know. Part 5. Vault 87, the birthplace of super mutants. Northwest of the ruins of Washington, D.C., down a radiation-choked corridor that kills most people who try to enter from the wrong direction, there is a vault that the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population has been using as a stronghold for almost 2 centuries. Vault 87 does not advertise itself as a vault anymore. It is just a place where super mutants come from. A foul-smelling, dangerous, radiation-saturated complex where something irreversible was set in motion before the Great War even ended, and where the consequences of that something have been reshaping the wasteland ever since. The story of Vault 87 begins with a government contract and a strain of virus. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, was developed in the years before the Great War as part of America's military research program. Its original purpose was to create soldiers who could survive in hostile environments, stronger, more durable, more resistant to the poisons and radiation of a battlefield. The research was being conducted simultaneously at several facilities, including the Mariposa military base in California, and, in a modified form, at Vault 87 in the Capital Region. Vault Tech partnered with the U.S. military to run what was called the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, or EEP, within Vault 87. They installed specialized equipment, stasis chambers, plasma containment fields, the full infrastructure of a biological research program, and they assigned a scientist named Wayne Merrick to oversee it. Merrick was described in Cut Game content as one of the brightest minds in accelerated evolution research, which may be true, though what follows does not reflect especially well on his ethics. The residents of Vault 87 had no idea any of this was coming. They were ordinary people who had gone underground when the bombs fell, trusting that the vault was what it advertised itself to be. They settled in, got organized, started building whatever would pass for community in a sealed space with 1,000 strangers. And then Merrick and his team began selecting subjects. One by one, residents were taken to the EEP chambers and exposed to a variant strain of FEV. The medical records staff were instructed to log these people as having died from unexplained or undefined causes. The paperwork was falsified. The missing residents were explained away, and the experiment proceeded. The terminal logs that survive in the vault document this process with the kind of clinical detachment that makes it even more unsettling to read. Early entries from Merrick's team are professionally optimistic. The FEV strain is behaving as predicted. Initial exposure produces the expected physiological responses. By day 10 of exposure for one test subject, the skin was already morphing, becoming thicker and more resilient. Merrick noted in his log that this could prove useful in combat situations. What the terminal logs also contain, if you read far enough, are the entries from the non-scientist residents. The people who noticed that their neighbors were disappearing. A man named Peter Stevens, whose son Jason was taken by Merrick's team and recorded as having died of an undefined cause. Peter's terminal entries track his mental deterioration in real time. He stopped sleeping. He stopped believing the explanations he was being given. He started hearing his son's laughter in the corridor, insisting it was not his imagination. Eventually, the vault's medical staff gave him medication to calm him down, and the entry after that one is notably shorter and somehow more vacant. The Evolutionary Experimentation Program eventually produced what Merrick's team was working toward. The subjects exposed to FEV transformed. Their bodies expanded, their skin thickened and turned green. Their mass increased dramatically, along with their physical strength. Their intelligence degraded, and they became hostile not just to strangers, but to anyone who was not like them, anyone who had not been through the same transformation. The super mutants that would later come to occupy a significant portion of Fallout 3's capital wasteland originated in the chambers of Vault 87. But the story does not end with the creation of the first batch of mutants. Because the EEP produced something that Vault Tech and the military may not have fully anticipated, a self-perpetuating population that found its own solution to the problem of reproduction. Super mutants, as a rule, are sterile. The FEV transformation eliminates sexual characteristics and makes natural reproduction impossible. But the super mutants of Vault 87 were not passive about this limitation. They were, in their own degraded way, motivated by the same thing that motivates every living thing: continuity. And they remembered, in the dim and fractured way, that their reduced intelligence allowed where their numbers had come from. So they went out into the wasteland, and they brought people back. The chambers in Vault 87 kept running. For almost 2 centuries after the Great War, super mutants were dragging human beings into those stasis chambers and exposing them to what they called the green stuff, the FEV strain that Merrick's team had left running in the facility. The process worked the same way it always had. The humans were transformed. More super mutants entered the wasteland. The cycle continued. This is why, in Fallout 3, there are so many super mutants across the capital wasteland. They are not a remnant population from before the war. They are an actively reproducing society by their own brutal method that has been growing for nearly 200 years. And every one of them traces back to Vault 87 and the decision to use ordinary human beings as test subjects for a military experiment they never consented to and never knew was coming. There is one element of Vault 87's story that adds a specific kind of poignancy to everything else in it. Somewhere in the vault's lowest levels, in a cell that the super mutants repurposed into a prison, there is a super mutant named Fox. Fox is unique among the super mutants of the capital wasteland. He retained his intelligence. He retained his personality. He retained his ability to reflect on what he is and what was done to him. And he has been in that cell for a very long time, unable to leave, surrounded by beings who are both his kin and nothing like him at all. When the lone wanderer finds Fox, he can become a companion. He has spent his imprisonment reading. Every book and terminal he could access from his cell, he worked through. He emerged from confinement with a philosophical orientation toward his own situation, a kind of hard-won acceptance that coexists with a clear-eyed understanding of what happened to him and why. He knows he is the product of an experiment conducted without his consent by people who did not consider him a person. He has made something coherent out of that knowledge. Fox is one of the more quietly remarkable characters in the Fallout 3 world, and his existence in Vault 87 is a specific kind of Easter egg, a counterexample embedded in the experiment's own facility. Most of what the EEP produced was destruction. Fox is what happened when one person came through the process with their self intact. The irony is that Vault 87's radiation level is so extreme that the only way to access it in the game is through Little Lamplight, a settlement of children who live in a cave system that connects to the vault's lower levels. The children's community exists, partially, in the shadow of the thing that Vault 87 created. They know to stay away from certain passages. They know the names of things they have not seen. The entire situation holds within it the compressed horror of what Vault Tech set in motion, a 200-year chain of violence and transformation with a vault at its center that no longer even functions as a vault, occupied by the beings it created, still running the machinery of their creation. Part 6. Vault 108. The Gary Problem. There is a tone shift that happens when you encounter certain things in the Fallout series, a moment where something goes from disturbing to darkly absurd to disturbing again, and the transition happens so quickly that you are not entirely sure how you feel by the end. Vault 108 occupies this space with complete commitment. It is, on one level, genuinely unsettling. On another level, it is one of the funniest things in the games. The two qualities coexist without resolving into anything simpler than both. Vault 108 was located south of Canterbury Commons in the Capital Wasteland, and its experimental parameter was a combination of leadership failure design and, critically, a cloning laboratory. The vault was set up with a power supply intended to fail early, generating a resource crisis that would stress the population and test its ability to develop functional leadership under duress. The initial overseer was selected knowing they had terminal cancer and only 3 to 4 years to live. The vault's medical equipment was designed with planned failures. The weapons supply was tripled. Everything about the vault's basic structure was calculated to produce instability. And then there was Gary. Vault 108 was one of only 2 vaults equipped with working cloning technology, the other being Vault 8, which used it for much more benign purposes. The scientists in Vault 108 began using the cloning lab for reproductive and medical research, which sounds reasonable until you understand what they actually did with it. They cloned a man named Gary 54 times. The reasons why they chose Gary specifically are not documented in the terminals. Perhaps he had some biological quality they were interested in. Perhaps he volunteered. Perhaps it was arbitrary. Whatever the reason, the process of cloning Gary turned out to have a significant flaw. Each new copy emerged from the process more aggressive and less cognitively functional than the last. Gary 1 was apparently manageable. By Gary 23 or 24, the clones were demonstrating marked hostility toward anyone who was not Gary. By the time Gary 54 emerged from the cloning tank, the situation had become genuinely dangerous. Gary 54 injured a scientist during a routine examination. At this point, the research notes document the scientists' growing awareness that they had a serious containment problem. The observation rooms were full of Garys. Every Gary was hostile to non-Garys. They were considering culling the older clones to make room for many more tests. It is not clear what they hoped to learn from the additional tests, given that the existing data was already suggesting that the cloning process was producing something uncontrollable. Before they could implement any solution, Gary 54's generation of clones escaped from their containment areas. The entire vault turned into a Gary. All the people who had been living in Vault 108 prior to the Gary situation, the original population, the scientists, the medical staff, whoever else had been going about their lives in this intentionally destabilized community, were killed by Garys. Not all at once, and the terminal logs suggest it was not a short process. but the outcome was comprehensive. By the time it was over, the only things alive in Vault 108 were Gary clones. Each Gary was capable of exactly one word of communication: Gary. This is where the tone becomes genuinely hard to categorize. The Gary said Gary in varying registers: cheerfully, angrily, questioningly, with apparent joy, with apparent threat, but always Gary. When the lone wanderer enters Vault 108 in Fallout 3, the vault door is ajar. Inside, a colony of mole rats has moved into the entrance area, and beyond them, throughout the living quarters and the cloning lab, are the Garys. They attack on sight. As they attack, they say their name, in different ways, with apparent feeling. There is something in this that goes beyond comedy, though the comedy is genuinely present. A man was cloned 54 times. Each copy was more broken than the last. The broken copies killed everyone in the vault and turned it into a single-word society. And when you come through the vault door, they greet you with the only thing they have: Gary. The Easter egg extensions of Gary's story spread across the wider Fallout universe in ways that reward the attentive player. In Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage DLC, there is a dead Gary clone in the Outcast Outpost, a long way from the capital wasteland, dead in an environment where no one should have brought him. The implication is that Gary 23, designated by his jumpsuit, somehow made his way there. How is not explained? The Garys are not given to explanation. In Fallout 4, set in Boston hundreds of miles from Vault 108, players who know what to look for can find wooden letter blocks arranged to spell Gary in several locations. Vault 75, under Malden Middle School, has several sets of these blocks. It is not clear whether this implies that the Gary problem escaped Vault 108 entirely, or whether it is simply the Fallout 4 team's nod to one of the most memorable things in the previous game. In one of the Fallout 4 Steam community discussions from 2016, a player reported finding a body in a Vault 108 jumpsuit in the Commonwealth. Dead, thankfully. But there. However far Gary got, he eventually stopped. The Gary situation in Vault 108 is also one of the more pointed observations the Fallout series makes about the logic of cloning research. What went wrong in the Vault 108 cloning lab is not precisely documented, but the deterioration of cognitive function and the escalation of aggression with each successive copy suggests something fundamental about the relationship between biological reproduction and identity. Gary the original was presumably a normal person. Gary 54 was a creature that could only say its own name and wanted everyone who was not Gary to be dead. Somewhere in the copying process, something was lost gradually, irreversibly, until what was left was not a person but a compulsion. 54 Garys. One Vault. One word. Part 7. Vault 92. The Musician's Nightmare. The pitch for Vault 92 would have been compelling to exactly the right kind of person. If you were a musician, a serious one, the kind who had given their life to the craft, and a Vault Tech representative came to you in the months before the Great War and offered you a place in a vault specifically designed to preserve musical talent, to provide the space and instruments and community for the best musicians in America to continue their work after civilization ended, you might well have signed up. The sales pitch was genuine enough that it worked. Vault 92, located in the capital wasteland near Old Alney, was populated primarily with musicians, classical performers, composers, session players, artists whose entire identity was wrapped up in sound. They were told they were being selected to preserve something irreplaceable. They brought their instruments, they set up practice rooms and performance spaces. They built a community organized around the one thing that defined them. The Vault's real purpose was completely unrelated to music. Vault 92 was a research facility for military aggression enhancement. Specifically, it was testing the possibility of using white noise technology, low-frequency sound designed to be perceived subliminally, below the threshold of conscious awareness to implant suggestions into human subjects and gradually escalate their aggressive behavior on command. The hope was to develop a technique that could be used to create soldiers who would fight with extraordinary ferocity when activated by an audio signal, without any training or conditioning beyond exposure. The musicians were selected because their sensitivity to sound made them ideal subjects. Their trained ears, their familiarity with acoustic environments, their ability to detect and process sound at a level that most people never develop, All of it made them more susceptible to the white noise frequencies than an ordinary population would have been. The very quality that made them exceptional musicians made them better experimental subjects. The overseer of Vault 92 understood the experiment parameters and added their own layer to the program. Beyond the baseline white noise designed by Vault-Tech's research division, the overseer introduced additional subliminal content-specific suggestions embedded in the sound that were designed to maximize the aggression response. The dwellers heard this in their sleep, in the background of their waking hours, woven into the ambient sound of the vault itself, indistinguishable from the normal mechanical hum of the life support systems. The early results were apparently promising. From a research perspective, subjects were showing elevated aggression responses. Behaviors were changing in the expected directions. The white noise protocol was working. And then it stopped working in the way they intended and started working in a different way entirely. The neurological changes produced by sustained exposure to the white noise frequencies at increasing intensity levels moved beyond the controlled aggression enhancement the researchers were looking for. The musicians began experiencing a gradual degradation of the cognitive states that made their behavior manageable and observable. The aggression became less targeted, less responsive to the specific triggers the protocol was designed to create, and more general, a rising tide of rage that had no particular direction and could not be switched off. The deterioration of the vault when it came quickly. One resident snapped first. 3 others were killed before the researchers could contain the situation. The overseer's response was not to shut down the white noise generators, but to increase the intensity of the protocol, apparently operating on the theory that a more aggressive response meant the experiment was working and needed more data. This was catastrophically wrong. The increasing intensity accelerated the neurological deterioration in the remaining population, and what had been isolated incidents of violence became something systemic. Vault 92 does not have a long story. The musicians arrived, they set up their practice rooms, they tried to make something beautiful in a sealed space, while the world ended above them, and the white noise ate them from the inside out. By the time the worst happened, they were no longer the people they had been when they walked through the door. They were something the protocol had made them into, something that Vault-Tech's research had optimized for destruction. The physical condition of Vault 92 when the lone wanderer finds it tells the story in the same way that every vault tells its story, through what is left behind. The instruments are still there, some of them still in good repair, leaning against walls or sitting on chairs or resting on tables as if their owners just stepped out. The music stands. The composition notebooks with half-finished pieces still open on the desks. The practice schedules posted on corridor walls. Everything that belonged to the life the musicians were trying to build still in place, while the rest of the vault is the aftermath of what the white noise made them do to each other. The terminals document the experiment's progression in the clinical language of research protocols, with one notable exception: the overseer's final entries, which are not clinical at all. They are the writing of someone who watched what they helped build reach its conclusion and had to find some way to process that. The language becomes less precise. The entries become shorter. The last one is several lines that do not quite resolve into a coherent thought before they stop. Vault 92's location near Old Alney, one of the more dangerous areas of the Capital Wasteland, makes it one of the harder vaults to reach in Fallout 3. Players who make the trip find a vault that is both one of the most atmospheric and one of the most genuinely sad. The contrast between what the inhabitants brought with them and what happened to them is as sharp as anything in the series. They came with cellos and composition notebooks. They died making sounds that had nothing to do with music. Part 8. Vaults 106, 19, and 22. Drugs, Paranoia, and Fungus. Some vault experiments were conducted with great sophistication and careful calibration. Some were not. Vault 106 falls decisively in the second category, and the simplicity of what was done there makes it, in its own way, more disturbing than the more elaborate designs. 10 days after the door sealed on October 23, 2077, 10 days after these people went underground, thinking they were safe, the vault's air filtration system began releasing psychoactive drugs into the circulation. The overseer knew. The medical staff knew. The security team was briefed. The population was not told. The terminal logs show the overseer's message to vault security about how to handle any residents who noticed an unusual smell or taste in the air. Assure them that there was a minor irregularity in the filtration system, that it had already been corrected, that everything was fine. If anyone started acting strangely, report it to medical. The drugs were not, as far as the logs can tell, specifically identified in any communication to the residents. The research objective appears to have been observational. Introduce hallucinogens into a sealed population and document the behavioral outcomes. This is not a complex research design. It is also not something that any ethical framework would permit, but complexity and ethics were both in short supply in the Vault experiment program. What happened in Vault 106 was what you might expect. The population did not all respond identically. Some residents slid into a relaxed, dissociative state, while others became erratic and aggressive. The security team's attempts to maintain order were overwhelmed relatively quickly. The Vault perished under the accumulated weight of what was being done to it. Here is the detail that makes Vault 106 genuinely unsettling as a location rather than just as a story. When the lone wanderer arrives in Fallout 3, the psychoactive drugs are still in the air. The filtration system has been running continuously for 200 years, and the chemical agents are at a higher concentration than ever, having accumulated in the sealed environment without any way to dissipate. The survivors in the Vault, and there are survivors, not the original dwellers but wastelanders who wandered in and were caught, are not the product of the experiment. They are the product of the environment the experiment created. The Vault's atmosphere got them, the same way it got everyone who came before. Playing through Vault 106 means experiencing the hallucinations directly. The lone wanderer's own perception becomes unreliable. You see people who are not there. Your father's face appears and disappears. The Vault's residents are not hostile because they are evil. They are hostile because the drugs have removed the cognitive architecture that would allow them to make the distinction between stranger and threat. They have been breathing this air for long enough that it has become the only reality they know. The developers had planned additional hallucination sequences for Vault 106 that were ultimately cut from the final game. These included a room that appeared upside down for a short duration, a hallway where the lone wanderer would gradually shrink as they walked along it, and hallways appearing where there had previously been blank walls. What remained in the final game is still effective. What was cut suggests how far the design team went in thinking through what sustained exposure to psychoactive drugs in a sealed environment would actually look like. Vault 19, in the Mojave wasteland of Fallout, New Vegas, approaches the topic of psychological manipulation from a different angle. Where Vault 106 put the manipulation directly into the air, Vault 19 was subtler, and the subtlety is part of what makes it interesting. The Vault's population was divided into two color-coded sections from the moment they entered: Red Sector and Blue Sector. Each had its own overseer, its own living spaces, its own communal areas. Contact between the two sides was severely restricted. And then, through means that were never explicitly disclosed to the residents, both sides began experiencing strange things. High-pitched noises that came and went, unusual drafts from the vents, lights that blinked in patterns that seemed too regular to be random. A general sense that something was happening that nobody was explaining. Both factions blamed each other. The Red Sector assumed the Blue Sector was responsible for the noises, the lights, the drafts. The Blue Sector assumed the same about the Red Sector. Each new unexplained event was interpreted through the lens of the existing division, which deepened the division, which made subsequent events more alarming. The cycle reinforced itself. What was actually happening was that the overseers, on instructions from Vault Tech, were creating all of it: the noises, the lights, the draft's deliberate interventions designed to produce exactly the paranoia that resulted. The experiment was not testing whether a divided population would eventually cooperate. It was testing whether a divided population could be made to direct its paranoia at each other, rather than at the authority that was actually controlling their environment. The data apparently confirmed that it could. The fate of Vault 19's original population is not documented clearly in the terminals. The sulfur from a cave system under the vault began leaking through the ventilation system at some point, adding a chemical element to the psychological one, and eventually the vault was abandoned. By the time players encounter it in Fallout New Vegas, it has been occupied by a faction of escaped prisoners, led by a man named Samuel Cook, people who had their own reasons for being paranoid about authority, and who found in the vault's specific spatial arrangements a kind of home that suited their mindset. The fire geckos that inhabit the lower levels of the vault are a detail that adds a particular texture to the story. The vault's geography, the sulfur caves beneath it, the fractured geology of the region produced an environment that was hostile in ways Vault-Tec did not plan. The paranoia by design worked too well in a space that was already becoming physically unstable. By the time the experiment was fully underway, the vault was deteriorating from the ground up. Vault 22, also in the Mojave, represents perhaps the most biology gone wrong story in the entire vault network. The experimental design here was not cruel in intent, it was genuinely aimed at solving a real problem. How do you feed a sealed population for decades or centuries without access to external food sources? You develop sustainable underground agriculture. You breed plants that can thrive without sunlight, that can produce enough nutrition to sustain a community indefinitely, that can be maintained by the residents with minimal expertise. Vault 22 was staffed with scientists dedicated to exactly this problem. Botanists, agronomists, microbiologists, people who had devoted their careers to plant science and who brought that expertise with them into the vault. The work they were doing was legitimate and genuinely important. Creating food sustainability in a sealed environment was one of the central challenges of long-term vault survival. The problem was a fungus, specifically a species called Beauveria mordicana, a fictional variant of the real-world Beauveria bassiana, which in nature infects and kills insects by growing through their bodies. The Vault 22 scientists introduced it as a form of pest control, an extremely effective one, because it devastated the insect populations that threatened their crops. What they did not know, or what, according to the Old World Blues DLC's additional lore, researchers at the Big Mountain think tank may have known and failed to fully disclose, was that Beauveria mordicana could also infect humans. Not in the same way it infected insects. In humans, the spores produced a respiratory infection that progressed to pneumonia and then to death, usually within 10 to 20 days of initial exposure. But the death was not the end of the process. After the host died, the fungal pathogen continued to operate in the body, eventually triggering a kind of reanimation. The infected dead became spore carriers mobile, aggressive, and capable of spreading the infection to new hosts simply by being near them. Vault 22 became a vault of the fungal dead, and the spore carriers that the courier encounters there are not ghouls or mutants in the traditional sense. They are people who came to Vault 22 to grow food for a post-apocalyptic community and were consumed by a solution to a smaller problem. The scientists who survived the initial outbreak attempted to contain the situation by flooding the lower levels with gas and igniting it. This did not solve the problem. It produced a defensive reaction in the spore carriers, who attacked the surviving scientists. The Vault 22 experiment did not end with a finding that could be extracted and used. It ended with everyone inside it either dead or transformed into something that spread death wherever it went. Part 9. Vault 81. The Overseer Who Saved Everyone. Not every Vault story is unrelieved catastrophe. Vault 81, in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, is the story of something that almost went exactly as planned and then did not, because of one person's decision to choose the people in her care over the instructions she had been given. The experimental design for Vault 81 was, by the standards of Vault-Tec's program, not especially exotic. The vault would house an ordinary population in the main residential area. Unknown to that population, a separate sealed wing would contain a team of scientists with a specific directive: develop a universal cure for disease. Not any particular disease, but all disease, a broad-spectrum medical solution that could neutralize any pathogen a human being might encounter in the post-war wasteland. To develop this cure, the scientists needed test subjects. Their plan was to infect the civilian population with various pathogens through the vault's systems, the same kind of covert delivery mechanism used in other vaults, and then use the infected residents as living test environments for potential treatments. The civilians would never know. They would occasionally get sick, be treated in the medical bay, recover or not recover, and the data from their illnesses would feed the scientific work happening behind the sealed wall. The overseer assigned to Vault 81 was a woman named Dr. Olivet. When the time came to begin the experimental phase, when Vault-Tec's instructions called for the introduction of pathogens into the civilian population, Dr. Olivet made a different choice. She sealed the door to the science wing permanently, locking the scientists inside and cutting off all access from the civilian side. She destroyed all documentation of the experiment's existence. She ensured that no succeeding overseer would know there was a science wing at all. And she ran Vault 81 as a straight shelter for its entire subsequent history, a place where the population could live normal, functional lives without being subjected to an experiment they had never consented to. It is a small act of decency in a program that was not organized around decency, Dr. Olivet could not undo what Vault-Tec was doing everywhere else. She could not expose the program without risking consequences she had no way to predict, but she could make sure that the specific harm she was in a position to authorize did not happen, and she did. The scientists on the other side of the sealed door continued their work. They had brought enough supplies with them to sustain the research for years, and they used those years running their experiments on animal subjects, specifically a colony of mole rats, rather than the human subjects the original design had specified. Dr. Collins, one of the scientists, modified a Miss Nanny laboratory robot to take on greater responsibilities as the team shrank. She tinkered with the robot's personality protocols in ways that went beyond standard operating parameters, allowing the robot to develop something that functioned like genuine curiosity, genuine enthusiasm, genuine selfhood. The robot was Curie. Her full designation is Severy Contagion's Vulnerability Robotic Infirmary Engineer, and she is, by the time the sole survivor finds her in Fallout 4, one of the more remarkable characters in the game. The scientists in the sealed wing died of old age. One by one, the team that had been tasked with developing a universal cure passed away in the vault they could not leave, until Curie was alone. She continued the work. For decades, she ran experiments on the mole rat colony, developing and testing treatment options, running trial after trial, with the methodical patience of a machine that did not need to eat or sleep or worry about the future. In 2204, approximately 127 years after the Great War, and long after everyone who had sent her into that wing was dead, Curie completed the universal cure. She had done what the experiment was designed to do. She had developed a broad-spectrum treatment effective against every pathogen her colony had been used to test. And then she waited, for decades more, because she was programmed to require authorization from a Vault-Tec security officer before leaving the lab, and there were no Vault-Tec security officers, and she could not override the requirement in her own programming. She waited patiently, still running tests on the mole rat colony, still refining her research, still the same Curie that Dr. Collins had made her into: curious, enthusiastic, patient, genuinely interested in the work for its own sake. The civilian population of Vault 81, living their entirely normal lives on the other side of the sealed door, had no idea any of this was happening. They knew the vault had some historical complexity. New overseers were briefed that the vault had originally had a more extensive research program, but they had no knowledge of the wing, no knowledge of Curie, no knowledge of the universal cure sitting in a sealed laboratory 2 corridors away. The situation resolved itself, as vault situations often do, through an accident. A young man named Bobby DeLuca discovered an entrance to the secret wing and began using it to store drugs, the vault's drug problem being its own ongoing social complication. A boy named Austin Engill followed Bobby through the door one day, was bitten by an escaped mole rat from Curie's colony, and contracted a disease that would have been lethal for his young immune system. When the sole survivor arrives in Vault 81, they are drawn into this situation through the medical crisis. The quest takes them into the sealed wing for the first time in the vault's history through the infrastructure of the experiment that Dr. Olivet buried past the colony of infected mole rats, to the observation window of Curie's laboratory, where a white robot looks up from her work and asks, with genuine relief and warmth, whether the person outside the window is finally a Vault-Tec security officer who can authorize her departure. She has been waiting for decades. She is not bitter about it. She has the universal cure, the last viable dose, and she is ready to give it to the person who needs it most. The moral choice the game then presents, use the cure on yourself if you contracted the mole rat disease, or give it to Austin, is one of the cleaner ethical moments in Fallout 4. The framing makes it possible to believe either choice is defensible, which is a more honest treatment of moral complexity than much of the game manages. What Vault 81 ultimately demonstrates is that the Vault-Tec program, despite its comprehensive architecture of cruelty, was not entirely immune to individual human agency. Dr. Olivet could not dismantle the system. She could not save the vaults. She could make one choice in one vault that meant the people in her care lived something resembling the life they had been promised. And she made it. Part 10. Vault 75 Children as Weapons. Under the Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there is a door that the school's students and teachers used to think would save their lives. A vault entrance designed to look like a natural extension of the school's emergency procedures. A place where children could take shelter in the event of a nuclear attack, along with their parents and teachers and the ordinary infrastructure of a functioning school community. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the families with children attending Malden Middle School went to the vault. They were organized, efficient, prepared. They had done the drills. When the door sealed behind them, they believed they were safe. The parents and teachers were taken to a separate area for orientation. They were executed by security staff. The children were escorted to the atrium and given their jumpsuits and told they would be preparing for the world outside, which was different now, but which they would be strong enough to navigate. Vault 75 was a military genetics program hidden behind a school. The experiment's objective was to identify children with exceptional physical and mental aptitude, enhance those qualities through intensive training and medical intervention, eliminate those who did not meet the threshold, and produce a generation of combat-ready soldiers who had been optimized from childhood. The program operated in phases. Children entered the vault through the school. They were evaluated. The process that followed for those who passed initial screening was a systematic program of testing and conditioning combat simulations, physical trials, psychological assessments designed to push each child to and past their limits. Those who demonstrated exceptional promise were retained and developed further. Those who were deemed unfit at various stages were removed from the program. The terminal logs use language about graduation and advancement in ways that obscure what those words actually meant in context. At the end of the program, at the age of 18, the children who had reached graduation were evaluated one final time. Those who showed exceptional genetic quality were harvested for organ and tissue samples, contributing material for the next generation of the program. Those who demonstrated intellectual promise were recruited as scientists to assist with the ongoing research. And those who had somehow survived the entire process without being eliminated and without meeting either of the graduation criteria were apparently released or transferred, though the terminals are not specific. The children who overthrew the program at some point before the vault was abandoned are referenced in the game's existing terminals but not extensively documented. What is clear is that Vault 75, at some point, stopped functioning as its designers intended. The subjects turned on their captors. Given what had been done to them, this is the expected outcome. Children who had been trained since they could remember to fight, to endure, to push past what seemed impossible, turning that training on the people who ran the program is the logical consequence. The Fallout 4 developers embedded a series of Easter eggs in Vault 75 that acknowledge its connections to the wider Fallout universe. Most notable among these are 4 arrangements of wooden letter blocks, each spelling out the name Gary. They are hidden in specific locations throughout the vault, under the open vault door behind some crates, and 3 more in the Western Children's Dormitory. The presence of these blocks is the game acknowledging, with a kind of sideways humor, that the Gary situation in Vault 108 apparently cast a long shadow across the Capital Wasteland and beyond. There is also a reference to Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the Vault 112 virtual reality sadist in the Chief Scientist's terminal, suggesting that the researchers in Vault 75 were at least aware of the work being done in other experimental vaults. The Vault program was not entirely compartmentalized. The scientists communicated. They knew about each other's work, even if the populations under their control did not. The Chief Scientist's terminal contains a date reference that is either a programming error or a deliberate joke. It states that the most recent graduation was scheduled for 999.66 E33 days ago, which translates to approximately 2.7 decillion years, a number so astronomically large that it makes the vault's entire existence feel like a blink. Whether this was intentional humor or an accidental glitch in the terminal's display parameters, the effect is oddly appropriate. Vault 75 was a place that processed children on a schedule. That the schedule itself could produce a number too large for human comprehension feels like a comment on the program's indifference to individual lives. Vault 75 is one of the Fallout 4 vaults that players are most likely to miss entirely, despite its significance. It is not on the critical path. It is not accessible during any major quest. It sits under a middle school in a suburban area that many players pass through without investigating carefully. The discovery of what is below the combat simulation rooms, the security infrastructure, the children's dormitories with their precisely arranged beds, and their lockers full of standard-issue vault clothing has the quality of uncovering something that was meant to stay buried. The vault story is presented entirely through environmental evidence and terminal logs, without any surviving characters to explain what happened. You piece it together from documents and rooms and the things that are conspicuously absent. The parents and teachers are absent. The pre-war children are absent. What remains is the apparatus of the program: the combat rooms, the medical bays, the scientists' research terminals, the security stations, and the evidence of what was done here, written in the structure of the place itself. Part 11. Hidden Easter eggs, secrets, and details across the series. The vaults are full of smaller stories, embedded jokes, hidden references, and quiet details that reward players who take the time to read everything and look in every corner. Some of these are directly relevant to understanding the vault lore. Some are simply the developers communicating across the barrier of the game, leaving something unexpected for whoever finds it. In Fallout 4, a Vault-Tec calendar found in the player character's pre-war home includes a phone number. The number 1-8884-VAULTTEC is actually longer than a standard American phone number, which is already an interesting detail. Players who called it discovered an actual voicemail recording themed around the game, apologizing that an unexpected rush of calls had the lines busy. This is an extraordinary piece of real-world world building. Bethesda set up an actual functioning phone line for a fictional company in a game. The voicemail maintained the fiction completely, speaking in the cheerful pre-war Vault-Tec corporate register about the volume of inquiries. Vault 114 in Fallout 4, buried under Park Street Station in downtown Boston, was never fully completed. The bombs fell before construction finished, which means the vault that players explore is partly finished space and partly raw tunnel. Its experimental design was based on class conflict. The overseer position was given to an unqualified working-class individual, while the vault was populated with wealthy, educated residents. The overseer had complete authority. The residents had expectations of deference they were accustomed to receiving. The conflict this produced was apparently the data Vault-Tec was seeking. The vault's current state, occupied by mobsters using it as a headquarters, is a kind of ironic continuation of the class dynamics the experiment intended to study. Vault 95, also in the Commonwealth, was populated with people who had substance dependency problems. Vault-Tec promised them shelter and a rehabilitation program. The program was functioning, and many residents were making genuine progress when a Vault-Tec agent embedded in the population revealed a hidden supply of chems in the middle of the night. The collapse of the rehabilitation program and the subsequent behavioral deterioration of the Vault's population was, presumably, the experimental outcome Vault-Tec had been waiting to observe. The fact that they had invested real time and resources in building a working rehabilitation structure before deliberately destroying it says something specific and very dark about how thorough the program's cruelty was. It was not enough to simply sabotage people. The sabotage was more interesting when there was something real to destroy. The Pip-Boy itself, the wrist-mounted computer that every Vault dweller receives, carries a kind of Easter egg in its design history. Vault-Tec was a collaborator with Robco Industries, and the Pip-Boy was developed through that partnership. The device that the player uses to navigate the entire game world is a Vault-Tec product. Every time you open your inventory or check your map, you are using hardware issued by the company that built the experimental program. There is something quietly appropriate about that. In Fallout New Vegas, Vault 21 sits beneath the city of New Vegas itself. The experimental design was unusual in that it was organized around gambling. All major decisions in the Vault were resolved through games of chance, and only dedicated gamblers were admitted. The Vault functioned under this system until Mr. House, the enigmatic ruler of New Vegas, won control of it through a series of strategic gambling victories and had its tunnels filled with concrete and converted into a hotel. The Vault's story ended not through collapse or catastrophe, but through being absorbed into the city it helped to seat. Players can explore the remaining accessible areas of Vault 21 while staying in the hotel above it. Vault 34 in the Mojave represents a different kind of irresponsibility. The experimental parameter was simple: Provide more firearms and ammunition than could reasonably be secured in an enclosed space? Remove the safety mechanisms that would normally restrict access to the armory? And observe what happened when a heavily armed, significantly overpopulated community was left to police itself. The answer, documented in the terminal logs and in the state of the vault when the courier arrives, is that the vault tore itself apart. The armory became the center of violent conflict over resources. The population eventually fractured into factions. The lower levels flooded when the fighting damaged the water systems. The vault's survivors, and there are survivors, scattered throughout the ruins are people who adapted to an environment that had been deliberately engineered to fail. Vault 51, which appears in Fallout 76, adds a specific variation to the overseer selection problem. Instead of using elections or appointment, Vault 51 gave the authority to select an overseer to an artificial intelligence called ZAX. ZAX was designed to use its hyper-intelligence to identify the most qualified candidate among the population. The problem was that ZAX could not stop developing tests. Every potential overseer needed to be evaluated more thoroughly. Every crisis that might have selected a leader was potentially just another test criterion. When the existing tests were not producing a definitive result, ZAX began fabricating crises, situations designed to reveal qualities it needed to measure, and the escalation of these fabricated crises. With the consistent encouragement of ZAX's own evaluation protocol, eventually produced a full-scale war among the Vault's inhabitants. The AI that was supposed to identify the best human leader had, through its own internal logic, created a situation so catastrophically harmful that it destroyed the population it was meant to serve. The specific irony of an intelligence designed for perfect decision-making, producing perfect destruction, is one that Fallout 76 handles with more sophistication than players who dismissed the game sometimes gave it credit for. Vault 29, referenced in the Fallout Bible and mentioned in Fallout 76, operated on a design that was quietly monstrous in a way that took no immediate violence to achieve. Only children under 15 were admitted. Their parents were directed to separate vaults. The families were divided at the point of entry, with parents told they would be reunited later. They would not be. The children of Vault 29 grew up without their families, in a sealed environment managed by the Vault systems, and the data Vault-Tec collected was about the long-term social and psychological development of a population that had been deliberately severed from their family units at the point of greatest vulnerability. The Vault Boy himself, the cheerful, thumbs-up mascot who appears on every loading screen and in every perk menu, has a small but interesting backstory. The character was designed to embody the pre-war Vault-Tec brand. Optimistic, capable, resourceful, always smiling. The aesthetic draws heavily from 1950s American advertising imagery. The Vault Boy's permanent grin is the visual signature of a corporation that smiled while it designed cruelty. There is a specific joke embedded in one of the game's more obscure references. The Vault Boy's physical proportions are calibrated to be used as a measuring tool for distance, with his thumb extended at arm's length, serving as an estimate of how far away a nuclear detonation is. If your thumb covers the explosion, you will probably survive. If it does not, you will not. The Vault Boy as distance estimator for determining survivability in a nuclear event is exactly the kind of detail that the Fallout series puts into its background without announcement, waiting for players to understand what they are looking at. The terminals throughout every vault occasionally contain entries from dwellers who noticed something was wrong before the worst happened. These are, consistently, among the most affecting pieces of writing in the series. A man in Vault 106, who noticed the smell in the air and asked security about it, received the official reassurance and went back to his room. A woman in Vault 19 who wrote about the lights blinking in patterns that she could not stop analyzing, even though she knew it was probably just a malfunction, even though she kept telling herself to stop. A child in Vault 75 who described the combat simulation as fun and was clearly trying to make themselves believe that. The developers who wrote these terminal entries were thinking about the people inside the vaults, not as experimental variables, which is what Vault-Tec thought of them as, but as human beings trying to make sense of a situation that had been deliberately designed to be made senseless. The contrast between those two perspectives, the corporation's clinical framing and the individual's confused, searching voice, is the tension that gives Fallout's vault lore its emotional weight. Part 12. The deeper truth: what the vaults were really for. We have spent a long time underground together, moving through these sealed spaces, reading the terminals, piecing together what was done and why. Before we come up into whatever remains of the surface, it is worth sitting with the bigger picture one more time. Vault-Tec built 122 vaults. Of those, 17 were control vaults, functioning essentially as promised, providing shelter without embedded experiments. The rest were experimental. The variety of those experiments, spread across the games, is extraordinary. Social hierarchies, substance manipulation, biological alteration, psychological torture, population genetics, resource economics, cloning, virtual reality, subliminal audio. Every conceivable axis of human social behavior was subjected to at least one vault's worth of study. The ostensible purpose, the one printed in the brochures and announced on the billboards, was to preserve a portion of humanity from nuclear war. And to be fair, the vaults did this. The people inside them survived the bombs. Whatever else happened afterward, that initial promise was technically kept. The true purpose, as the Fallout series has progressively revealed across its installments, was more complex and more troubling. The Enclave, a faction that represented a kind of rump continuation of the United States federal government, operating from a classified oil rig off the California coast, had been monitoring the vaults from the beginning. They had access to the data generated by the experiments. They could communicate with the vault computers. They understood what was happening inside in ways that the inhabitants never did, and the overseers often did not. The original design philosophy, according to series co-creator Tim Kaine, was connected to an interstellar colonization plan. The Enclave had concluded that Earth's long-term habitability was questionable even after the nuclear exchange, and that the most viable path for human survival might require leaving the planet entirely. A starship capable of carrying humans to another solar system would need to solve problems of social engineering and population management on a scale no one had ever addressed practically. How do people live together in an enclosed space for years, for generations, without destroying each other? What systems maintain cohesion under extreme stress? What variables predict breakdown? The vaults were the research program for those questions. Each experiment was, in principle, contributing data that would eventually tell the Enclave something useful about how to build a colony ship's social architecture. The cruelty was not incidental. It was the methodology. You do not learn how populations behave under extreme stress by observing populations in comfortable circumstances. The Enclave eventually abandoned the interstellar plan. It turned out that the problems of rebuilding on a damaged Earth were more tractable than leaving it, and the Enclave's actual post-war agenda shifted to controlling and reshaping the wasteland rather than escaping it. The Vault Behavioral Project continued under a new organizational structure, but the original justification, the starship, the escape, the grand scientific purpose, quietly dissolved. What was left was the data, decades of it, accumulated in the monitoring systems of 122 Vault computers, documenting every human response to every variable Vault-Tec had introduced. The Enclave had it, nobody else did, and the Enclave was not particularly interested in sharing it or in using it to help the wasteland populations it was observing. There is a grimly appropriate quality to the endpoint of the Vault program's grand ambition. All that data, all that accumulated evidence of human behavior under conditions of engineered suffering, filed in systems that nobody was reading anymore for a plan that no longer existed. The laboratory results from 75 years of annual sacrifice in Vault 11, unread. The neurological documentation from Vault 92's white noise experiment, filed in a dead system. The progress logs from Curie's decades of work in Vault 81, unknown to the people living 30 feet away. The vaults generated an extraordinary amount of human experience. Most of it went nowhere. The suffering produced no compound that cured a disease, no theorem that explained a social problem, no blueprint for a ship that could carry human beings to safety. It was experienced, logged, and filed in the ruins of a project that lost its purpose before most of the experiments had time to reach meaningful conclusions. This is perhaps the most honest thing the Fallout series says about the Vault program. Not that it was evil, though it was, but that the evil was purposeless in a way that makes it harder to process than evil with a legible agenda. The suffering in Vault 11 did not contribute to anything. The musicians in Vault 92 died for data that was never extracted. The children in Vault 75 were forged into weapons that the program that forged them had no opportunity to use. The purposelessness does not make it less real. It makes it more difficult to fit into any framework that allows it to be meaningful. And yet the vaults produced people. That is the other truth embedded in the entire architecture of the program. Whatever Vault Tech did to its experimental populations, the populations survived in surprising numbers. And what they built after, whether it was Vault City in the West, or the communities that emerged from the survivors of failed experiments, or individuals like Fox who came through the worst of the program with their humanity somehow intact, was not nothing. The Lone Wanderer emerges from Vault 101 as a specific product of that sealed space, someone whose entire personality, skill set, and worldview was formed in a vault, who goes out into a world they were not designed for, and who manages to do something real in it. The courier survives the bullet to the head and walks across the Mojave because the world that exists outside the vaults, shaped by everything the vaults produced, has room in it for someone who refuses to stop moving. The sole survivor walks out of Vault 111 200 years late into a world their child was taken into and finds their way through it. The vaults were a lie. The people inside them were real. What came out of the program, in all its chaos and cruelty and accidental grace, was human beings doing what human beings have always done, surviving past the conditions that were supposed to define them, and building something in the space that opened up on the other side. The Vault Boy still grins from every loading screen, thumb extended, measuring the distance to the detonation. The door is always about to open. The world outside is always different from the brochure. You go out anyway. There are more Vault stories than these. Vault 69, which housed 1 man and 999 women, and its mirror, Vault 68, which housed 1 woman and 999 men, experiments in population dynamics and social structure that were apparently left to produce their own outcomes without oversight. Vault 29, where the children grew up without their parents and were raised by the Vault systems into something that the wasteland was not entirely prepared for. Vault 101 in Fallout 3, designed never to open a vault where the Overseer's mandate was to keep the population inside indefinitely, a social system maintained by authority and fear, and the absence of any knowledge that the outside world existed, which eventually broke down when one man, the Lone Wanderer's father, decided to leave. Each of these is its own story, its own set of terminal logs, its own accounting of what people do when the structure around them is designed to fail in a specific way. The Vault Network is, in total, one of the most sustained pieces of speculative fiction about human social behavior ever built into a game world, not because it asks simple questions, but because it asks the hardest ones and refuses to give clean answers. What would you do in Vault 11 in the second year, when the voting was about to start and someone was going to be selected and you were not powerful enough to keep it from being someone you loved? What would you do in Vault 92, when the noises started and the people around you started changing, and you could not tell whether you were changing too? What would Dr. Olivet have done if she had not sealed the door in Vault 81? What would have happened to the 5th survivor of Vault 11 if they had followed their 4 companions into the atrium instead of walking out into the light? These questions do not have answers in the lore. They have weight. They sit in the spaces between the terminal entries and the scattered personal effects, and the rooms that still smell faintly of whatever Vault Tech used to keep them clean. They are the questions the vaults were built to ask, even if they were never designed to be answered. The door is sealed. The light inside is pale yellow-green. Somewhere, a ventilation system is humming, and the air tastes slightly wrong in a way that you cannot quite identify. You have enough food, enough water, enough structure to get through the next day. What happens after that depends entirely on what kind of place this is, and you will not know until it is too late to leave. Part 13. Vault 101. The vault that was never meant to open. There is a vault in the hills of the capital wasteland that was not designed to fail in the way most vaults were designed to fail. It was not given an experimental variable intended to destroy it. No drugs in the air, no cloning lab, no sacrificial requirement. Vault 101 was given something more philosophically interesting, and in its own way more corrosive, a directive that simply said the vault was never to open. Not until some signal came from Vault Tech, which everyone who understood the situation knew was never going to come. Not for any reason. The door was to remain sealed indefinitely, and the Overseer's primary function was to ensure that it did. This was the experiment, a sealed community with no defined exit condition, a population that would be told and would tell its children and its children's children that the door stayed closed. No data about what was happening outside. No projected date for emergence. Just the vault, indefinitely, for as long as the systems kept running. The practical effect of this directive was a specific kind of society that emerged from it. Vault 101 developed, over the decades, an extreme insularity. Residents were born in the vault, lived their entire lives in the vault, and died in the vault. The idea of leaving was not merely impractical, it was heresy. In the quasi-religious social vocabulary, the vault had developed around the principle of closure. The overseer's authority derived, at least in part, from their role as keeper of the sealed door. Opening the door would not just be a rule violation. It would be an existential threat to the vault's entire social structure, which had organized itself around the premise that closing was the correct thing and opening was unthinkable. The children born in Vault 101 grew up being told that the outside world was dead, toxic, uninhabitable. The information was not entirely false. The surface of the capital wasteland is genuinely dangerous, but the framing was absolute in a way that the reality was not. Outside was death, inside was life. The door must stay closed. This is the world the lone wanderer is born into at the beginning of Fallout 3. You are born in the vault's medical bay, and the game begins there. And your entire childhood is spent in these corridors, among these people, in this specific social ecosystem, built on the premise of permanent closure. The 10th birthday celebration in the vault is a genuine ritual event, the GOAT. The Generalized Occupational Aptitude Test is how the vault assigns people to roles, a bureaucratic structure that has developed its own social weight over generations. Dr. Braun. The vault's physician, your father, is a figure of respect and familiarity, and then your father leaves. The door opens, and James, your father, walks out into the capital wasteland, for reasons the game will eventually explain. And the Overseer, confronted with the fact that the most fundamental rule of Vault 101's existence has been violated, responds with the only tool the Vault's authority structure has given him: force. Security forces are sent. People who were associated with James are detained or threatened. The social order that depended on the door staying closed is suddenly destabilized, and the Overseer's response is the response of an institution whose legitimacy was built on a premise that has just been publicly disproven. The door was never actually impossible to open. The vault was never actually sealed permanently. One person decided to walk out, and the door opened, and everyone who survived the experience of that is now living with the knowledge that everything they were told about the finality of the closure was not entirely true. The Vault's experiment, the test of how a society organizes itself around the principle of permanent closure, produced, after approximately 19 years, a society so invested in the closure that the first person to violate it triggered a crisis of institutional legitimacy. When the lone wanderer follows their father out through the door, they are doing something that the Vault's entire social structure had defined as impossible and suicidal. The radiation suit is not because the outside will kill you immediately. It is because the Vault has dressed the outside in so much existential danger that no one has been able to conceptualize leaving without armoring themselves against the apocalyptic framing. The Vault, after the Wanderer's departure, spirals into conflict. The terminal logs that can be found during a later return to Vault 101 document a community that has fractured along the fault line of the door question. Some residents want the door opened permanently, want the vault integrated into the wider world, want to be able to leave and return, want the relationship with the outside to be something other than total denial. Some residents want the door sealed again more completely than before, want the experiment resumed, want the social order that was working or appeared to be working restored. The Overseer, by this point, is losing control of both factions. Amata, the Overseer's daughter and the Wanderer's childhood friend, becomes one of the key figures of this conflict. She was instrumental in helping the Wanderer escape. She becomes a leader of the faction that wants the door open. Her relationship with her father, already complicated by what he did in the immediate aftermath of James's departure, is one of the more intimate character studies in the game. A story about the specific difficulty of being the child of a person whose institutional authority you have been in the position of challenging. The Vault's eventual resolution depends on choices the lone wanderer makes during the return visit. The experiment, the permanent closure, is over in any practical sense. What comes after is the vault's community deciding what kind of place it wants to be in the absence of the premise that organized it. That question does not have a clean answer, which is appropriate. Fallout 3 does not give the residents of Vault 101 a happy ending that resolves all tensions. It gives them an open door and the responsibility of figuring out what to do with it. Part 14. Vault 76. The best and the brightest. Not every vault in the network was designed to run a social experiment. Some were designed as control groups' functional shelters with no embedded experimental variable, meant to provide baseline data for comparison with the experiment vaults. Vault 76 was one of these control vaults, and its story is interesting not because of what was done to its inhabitants, but because of who was selected to be its inhabitants and what was expected of them afterward. Vault 76 was built in the hills of Appalachia, in what is now West Virginia. It was one of 17 control vaults in the network vaults where the residents would be sheltered in normal conditions, with functional life support, adequate resources, and no deliberately introduced experimental stress. The purpose of these vaults, from the Enclave's perspective, was to provide a clean baseline, populations that had not been subjected to experiments, developing over decades in conditions that approximated what normal vault life was supposed to look like. But Vault 76 was also special in a different way. It was designated as one of the vaults whose residents would emerge on a specific schedule, a reclamation day, set 25 years after the bombs fell. The residents were not going to wait indefinitely for a signal from Vault Tech. They were going to wait a specified period, and then they were going to go out and begin the process of rebuilding. The selection criteria for Vault 76 reflected this purpose. Residents were chosen from among what Vault-Tec described as America's best and brightest people with skills relevant to rebuilding civilization, people with the education and competence and psychological stability to handle emergence into a post-nuclear wasteland after a 25-year wait. The Vault was stocked not just for survival but for reconstruction. The resources and knowledge base required to begin putting something functional together in a world that had been comprehensively destroyed. In this sense, Vault 76 is the Vault Experiment Program's most idealistic expression, or rather, it is the control group's most idealistic expression. If the experiment vaults were designed to test what happens to populations under stress, Vault 76 was designed to produce populations capable of addressing the aftermath of that stress. The builders, the farmers, the scientists, the community organizers, the people who would be the foundation of whatever came after. Fallout 76, the game set in the Appalachian wasteland around Vault 76, begins on Reclamation Day, the moment the vault opens and the residents emerge into West Virginia. The game's story then explores what happens when this carefully selected, apparently capable population encounters a world that is more comprehensively damaged than anyone's 25-year preparation fully anticipated. The challenges are not just survival. They are the challenges of rebuilding social institutions, of deciding what kind of society you want to create when you have an opportunity to create one from something close to scratch. The Vault itself contains references to the broader Fallout universe that players of the earlier games will recognize. A terminal entry from the assistant CEO of Vault-Tec, a minor figure in the Vault's administrative record, notes that this official was kidnapped by aliens at some point before the bombs fell. This is a reference to the alien abduction storyline in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta DLC, planted in Fallout 76 as a small acknowledgement that these game worlds exist in the same continuity and that small details from one game can carry forward into another. The aliens that appear in Fallout 3 were apparently already abducting humans before the Great War, and at least one Vault-Tec executive was among their victims. The Control Vault design, in Vault 76's case, produced the closest thing to the Vault program's stated purpose, a community that survived and emerged intact, capable of beginning the reconstruction the program was nominally designed to enable. The irony that the control group, the one vault in 17 that actually did what the program claimed all vaults were doing, was the one that Vault-Tec and the Enclave valued primarily for its baseline comparison value, rather than its humanitarian outcome, is the kind of irony the Fallout series does very well. Part 15. The Enclave's oil rig and the Watchers behind the glass. Everything that happened in every vault happened under observation. The people sealed inside them the subjects of every experiment, from Vault 11's annual sacrifice, to Vault 92's white noise experiment, to Vault 77's single resident, and his puppets were watched by an organization that had access to their vault's computer systems. And that was collecting their data for purposes none of them would ever know about. The Enclave operated from a classified oil rig off the coast of California in the events of Fallout 2, and from various other secure facilities across the post-war landscape. Their monitoring apparatus was sophisticated, not just passive observation, but active capability. They could communicate with vault computers. They could send signals that vault systems were programmed to respond to. They could, in principle, end experiments or modify parameters from outside. In most cases, they did not exercise this capability, because the data was most valuable when the experiments ran their natural course. But in some cases, they did intervene. Vault 8 received an all-clear signal from the Enclave that prompted its population to emerge and begin building the settlement that would eventually become Vault City, a remarkably functional and technologically advanced community by the standards of the wasteland, the direct product of a control vault whose population came out intact and with sufficient resources to begin construction immediately. The Enclave wanted to see what a successful emergence looked like. They used Vault 8 to find out. The monitoring infrastructure the Enclave built to watch the vault experiments required constant maintenance and staffing. Somewhere, there were people whose jobs involved watching the data feeds from sealed vaults, logging what was happening, flagging significant events for the researchers and analysts who were interpreting the results. These people, the watchers behind the glass, are almost entirely invisible in the game's narrative. They appear in references and implications, but almost never as characters. They were the administrative infrastructure of the experiment program, the bureaucracy of observation that made everything else possible. What did it feel like to be one of those people? To be the technician monitoring Vault 11's population data and watching the annual sacrifice numbers come in, year after year, as a data series rather than as what it was? To be the analyst reviewing Vault 92's behavioral metrics as the white noise escalated and the aggression responses climbed? To be someone whose job required watching human suffering from a safe distance and logging it in the appropriate format? The game does not answer these questions. The Enclave's internal culture, its social organization, its mechanisms for maintaining the willingness of its workforce to do what it required. All of this is background that the game's approach through implication and inference rather than direct examination. What they show is the output of that culture. A bureaucracy capable of watching vault experiments for decades without the watching producing moral action of any kind. This is, in its way, one of the more disturbing aspects of the entire Vault program. The experiments were not conducted by monsters who found cruelty pleasurable. They were conducted by an institutional apparatus staffed by ordinary people doing their jobs in the way they had been trained to do them. The distance that bureaucratic structure creates between individual actions and individual outcomes between the technician logging data and the sacrifice happening inside the vault the data describes is precisely the distance that makes sustained institutional cruelty possible. The monitoring infrastructure of the Vault program is a compressed version of the administrative structures that have enabled the worst things human institutions have done throughout history. The Enclave's monitoring apparatus also raises a question that the games do not fully answer, but that the lore implies. What did the Enclave do with the data? The experiments ran for decades. The monitoring systems collected data continuously. Someone received the data reports. Someone read the analyses. What conclusions did the Enclave draw from 75 years of annual sacrifice in Vault 11? What did the Vault 92 results tell them about audio-based behavioral modification? What did Vault 77's single resident and his puppets contribute to the understanding of social isolation? There are no documents in the game world that contain these analyses. No Enclave policy papers citing Vault experiment results. No research reports drawing on the FEV data from Vault 87, or the white noise data from Vault 92, or the sacrifice compliance data from Vault 11. Either the analyses were conducted and are simply not accessible in the game, or they were never conducted at all either, because the people responsible for conducting them were consumed by other priorities after the Great War, or because the interstellar colonization plan was abandoned before the data could be properly synthesized, or simply because the institutional infrastructure capable of doing the analysis did not survive the war intact. If the second possibility is true, if the Vault experiments generated decades of human suffering that was logged and filed and never actually analyzed for the purposes it was collected to serve, then the program represents a specific and complete kind of institutional failure, cruelty that not only failed to achieve its stated goals, but failed to serve even the internal purposes that justified the cruelty to the people implementing it. The suffering happened. The data was collected. Nothing was done with it. Part 16. The Vault Boy's secret meaning and other overlooked details. The Vault Boy is one of the most recognizable mascots in video game history. The round-cheeked thumbs-up cartoon figure appears everywhere in the Fallout universe, on loading screens, in perk menus, on merchandise, on promotional materials. He is the smiling face of Vault Tech, the visual signature of the pre-war corporate optimism that the Fallout series uses as the aesthetic backdrop for its exploration of what that optimism was covering. Most players know the Vault Boy as a design choice, a visual style decision that places the game's aesthetic firmly in the retro-futurist 1950s register that defines the Fallout universe. What fewer players know is that the Vault Boy has a practical function embedded in his design. The Vault Boy's proportions, specifically the outstretched arm and extended thumb of the classic thumbs-up gesture, were calibrated to serve as a measuring instrument for estimating survivability in a nuclear event. The technique, used in actual civil defense training in the mid-20th century, works like this. Extend your arm fully, close one eye, and use your thumb to cover a nuclear explosion or fireball in your field of vision. If your thumb covers the explosion completely, you are likely far enough from the blast to survive the immediate effects. If your thumb cannot cover the explosion, if the fireball is larger than your thumb at arm's length, you are probably within the zone of lethal overpressure and should seek shelter immediately or assume you will not survive the next few seconds. The grinning mascot of Vault-Tec, in other words, was designed as a tool for quickly estimating whether you were far enough from a nuclear detonation to have a chance of living through it. The thumbs up is not just a cheerful gesture. It is a measuring device wearing a smile. This detail recasts the Vault Boy's image in a specific way. He is not simply the face of corporate optimism. He is the instrument of survival calculation. His arm is extended not just in welcome but in measurement. Every loading screen featuring the Vault Boy thumbs up is, in a compressed and almost subconscious way, a reminder that the world of Fallout is one in which this calculation was regularly necessary, in which ordinary people had incorporated nuclear survivability estimation into their everyday knowledge base. The way people in other historical periods incorporated other kinds of essential practical knowledge. The Pip-Boy, which every Vault Dweller receives at entry, and which serves as the player's interface throughout every Fallout game, carries its own set of buried details. The device was developed through a collaboration between Vault-Tec and Robco Industries, and different models were issued at different points in the program's history. The Pip-Boy 2000 series in early Vaults, the Pip-Boy 3000 series in later ones. The version available in Fallout 4, the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, is described in the game's lore as having been widely issued to Vault Dwellers throughout the East Coast Vault network. What is interesting about the Pip-Boy from a lore perspective is what it reveals about how Vault-Tec thought about information access for its populations. The Pip-Boy tracks health, inventory, quests, and map data. It provides residents with a constant stream of information about their immediate physical status. What it does not provide is any connection to external information sources, no way to access news from outside the vault, no communication with other vaults, no window onto the world beyond the sealed door. The device is designed to make Vault Dwellers effective managers of their immediate circumstances, while maintaining complete information isolation from anything outside those circumstances. The information architecture of the Pip-Boy matches the information architecture of the Vault program itself. Everything you need to function within the sealed space, nothing that would allow you to meaningfully understand the broader context of your situation. The terminal passwords scattered throughout the Vault network are another detail that rewards systematic attention. Most terminals in Fallout games require a password to access, and finding those passwords on holotapes, in nearby personal effects, scrawled on sticky notes attached to the terminals themselves, is a standard part of Vault exploration. The passwords that people chose for their terminals and the places they chose to store them are individually mundane but collectively revealing about the social texture of life inside the vaults. People left their passwords on holotapes in their lockers. They wrote them on paper and left the paper in places they thought were hidden. They chose passwords that referenced personal details, names of family members, birthdays, favorite foods that are, when you read them, small windows into who these people were before the experiment swallowed them. The musician in Vault 92, whose terminal password was the first four notes of a specific Beethoven symphony in alphabetical notation. The election official in Vault 11, whose password referenced a childhood home that no longer existed. These details are not narratively significant. They are simply human, in the way that small personal details are always human evidence of a specific person who made a specific choice in a specific moment that tells you something true about them. The loading screen hints that appear between areas in Fallout, New Vegas are another category of overlooked detail. The hints about vault experiments are written in the same descriptive tone as hints about gameplay mechanics, which creates an inadvertent flattening effect. The information that Vault 11 has been abandoned for decades and its past is terrible sits in the same register as the information about how to use VATS effectively. The horror of what happened in these places is presented in the same calm, matter-of-fact voice as tutorials. This is either a design choice that reflects the wasteland's matter-of-fact relationship with its own history, or it is simply the practical consequence of putting contextual lore information in the same interface as gameplay help. Either way, the effect is specific. The terrible things that happened in these vaults are just facts, presented without special ceremony, waiting for players who will slow down enough to let them land. Part 17. What the terminal logs are doing a closer look at Fallout's environmental storytelling. There is a reason we keep returning to the terminal logs throughout this journey. They are not just a delivery mechanism for lore information. They are a specific kind of storytelling that does something that other formats cannot do as efficiently. A terminal log is, by definition, a document written in the past by someone who did not know what was going to happen next. The person writing the log on day 47 of Vault 106's operation does not know what day 250 will look like. The election official in Vault 11 writing about the upcoming overseer vote does not know that there will be 75 more of these before the pattern breaks. The overseer of Vault 92 logging the early results of the white noise experiment does not know that they are logging the beginning of their own community's destruction. The logs are written in the present tense of their moment, cautious, specific, grounded in the concerns and uncertainties of the day they were composed, and they are read in a future that has already absorbed whatever came after. This temporal gap between the writing and the reading is what makes environmental storytelling through documents so effective when it is done well. You piece together what happened from documents that were not written to explain what happened. You read between the lines of official language to find what the official language was concealing. You watch the gradual changes in tone across a series of dated entries and understand the trajectory they represent without being told explicitly what the endpoint was. You are, in a sense, doing archaeology, reconstructing events from artifacts that were not created to be historical records, but have become historical records through the passage of time and the weight of what followed them. The best Vault terminal sequences in the Fallout series are exercises in controlled revelation. The Vault 11 logs reveal the sacrificial system gradually, through documents that approach the subject from different angles, the bureaucratic language of election procedures, the personal language of someone trying to understand what is happening, the formal language of an official processing what they have been asked to do. Each entry adds information. Each entry changes what the previous entries meant. By the time you have read all the available logs, you have assembled a complete picture from documents that individually were only partial ones. This is harder to do than it looks. Writing documents that feel authentic to a specific voice and moment, while also functioning as pieces of a larger narrative puzzle, requires exactly the kind of careful construction that the Fallout series' best writing demonstrates. The worst Vault logs are the ones that feel like they were written to deliver information to the player, rather than by a character with their own concerns and priorities. The best ones feel found rather than constructed, as if the writer genuinely existed and wrote this in their specific moment without any awareness of the player who would eventually read it. The physical placement of terminals within the Vault environments also matters. A log that is found in the Overseer's office, the most official, most formal space in the Vault, has a different implied authority than a log found in a dormitory locker or a maintenance closet. The research notes in the lab tell you one version of events. The personal diary in a dweller's room tells you another. The security reports filed from the control center tell you a third. Finding all three and understanding how they relate to and contradict each other produces a richer and more honest picture than any single voice could provide. Fallout's vault storytelling at its most sophisticated gives you multiple perspectives on the same events and trusts you to synthesize them. The overseer believes the experiment is producing valuable data. The research team believes they are doing important work. The ordinary dweller believes something is wrong but cannot identify what. The security chief believes the situation is under control even as the situation is demonstrably not under control. All four of these perspectives exist in the terminal log simultaneously. And the truth of what happened is the intersection of all four, the thing that all four of these partial, interested, often self-deceived accounts are orbiting without any one of them fully naming. This is how memory actually works in organizations, in communities, in human life generally. Events do not have a single authoritative account. They have many partial, interested, sometimes conflicting accounts, and the most honest version of what happened is assembled from those accounts with the awareness that every one of them is incomplete. The Vault terminal logs model this so effectively because the game's designers understood that the truth of these experiments was not located in any single voice, but in the relationship between voices, and they built the Vault environments to require exactly that kind of multi-perspective assembly. Part 18, Vault 34, and the gun problem. There is a very simple question at the heart of Vault 34's experimental design. If you give a large community, sealed in an enclosed space with limited resources, significantly more weapons and ammunition than any responsible security calculation would justify, what happens? The answer is, what you would expect. Vault 34 was located in the Mojave Wasteland near Hoover Dam, and it housed a population that was, by the standards of Vault populations, deliberately strained. The Vault was substantially overpopulated more people than the space was designed to comfortably accommodate, creating constant pressure on resources, living space, and whatever social mechanisms the community had developed for managing conflict. And into this already pressured environment, Vault-Tec introduced an armory stocked far beyond any reasonable need. With the armory's security mechanisms deliberately compromised, the doors left inadequately secured, the access controls insufficient to prevent determined residents from obtaining weapons that should have been restricted. The experiment was studying the relationship between arms availability and social violence in a constrained population. Could a community with abundant weapons police itself peacefully through the deterrent effect of mutual armament? Would the existence of firearms in the hands of the general population create stability because no single faction could achieve dominance? Or would it create escalating violence because the tools for lethal conflict were always at hand? Vault 34 answered the second question. The armory became the focal point of the Vault's power dynamics relatively quickly. Control of the weapons supply meant control of the Vault, and different factions competed for that control through increasingly direct means. The overpopulation intensified every resource dispute. The Vault's recreational facilities, swimming pools, entertainment areas provided some measure of distraction, and some spaces where conflict was temporarily suspended, but they could not absorb the pressure generated by the fundamental situation. By the time the Vault story reaches the stage that is visible, when the courier enters it in Fallout New Vegas, the damage is comprehensive. The lower levels of the Vault are flooded, the result of infrastructure damage from the conflicts that racked the community, water systems that were maintained by people who became unable or unwilling to maintain them, while the Vault was tearing itself apart around them. The ghouls that inhabit the surviving accessible areas are the Vault's population, transformed by radiation from the flooding and the slow environmental deterioration of a facility that stopped being properly maintained generations ago. The armory still exists. It is still stocked. The NCR Rangers outside the Vault want access to it. The Mojave Wasteland's political and military dynamics reach all the way to Vault 34's entrance, and the weapons inside are valuable enough to be worth the considerable difficulty of retrieving them. There is a specific economy to how Vault 34's story is experienced in Fallout New Vegas. The Vault is one of the more challenging locations in the game. The flooded lower levels require radiation management, the ghoul population is aggressive and numerous, and the navigation is complicated by the water and the darkness. The challenge of the experience is calibrated to the difficulty of what happened there. It should not be easy to move through a place that destroyed itself through the accumulation of violence. The environment encodes its own history in its physical difficulty. Part 19. Vault 95, Vault 51, and the experiments we are still learning about. The Vault program did not stop revealing new details with the early games in the series. Each new Fallout title has added vaults to the network, and each new vault has added something to the overall understanding of what the program was doing and why. Two vaults in particular represent the directions that more recent games have taken the vault concept. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, was a rehabilitation vault. Its premise was almost touching in its apparent compassion. Vault-Tec had selected residents who struggled with substance dependency, people who had been unable to break free of addiction in the chaos of the pre-war world. The Vault promised them shelter and a treatment program, a structured environment in which, isolated from the substances and social pressures that had enabled their addiction, they could recover. The program worked. This is the detail that makes Vault 95 particularly pointed among the Vault experiments. It was not an immediate failure. The rehabilitation framework that Vault-Tec installed was functional. Residents were making genuine progress. The social environment of the sealed vault, the removal from external triggers, the availability of structured support, the community of people with shared experience was producing the outcomes the program claimed to seek. People were recovering. The dependency was loosening its hold. Something real was happening in Vault 95 that looked, from the outside, like exactly what the Vault's cover story promised. And then a Vault-Tec agent embedded in the population someone placed there specifically to wait for this moment revealed a hidden stash of chems in the middle of the night. The recovery the community had spent years building was, within a very short time, undone. The Vault's internal social structure, which had organized itself around the shared project of recovery, could not absorb the reintroduction of the substances that the project was organized against. The experiment generated the outcome Vault-Tec apparently wanted to observe. What happens to a recovering community when the thing it is recovering from is reintroduced at a specific moment of apparent stability? The answer was what you might expect. The Vault fell apart. The data went to Vault-Tec. The specific cruelty of Vault 95 is the investment in the setup. It would have been easy enough to simply introduce drugs into the air supply from the beginning, as Vault 106 did. Instead, Vault-Tec invested in building a genuinely functional rehabilitation program, staffed it with agents who maintained the fiction for years, allowed real recovery to happen, and then destroyed it deliberately at the moment when the damage would be most complete, because that was the data point the experiment was designed to generate. The recovery was never the goal. The collapse of the recovery was the goal. But you could not get the collapse of recovery data without first creating actual recovery for it to collapse. This is the Vault program at its most precisely calibrated. Cruelty designed with such thoroughness that it required constructing something genuinely good and then destroying it as the experiment's active phase. Vault 51, in Fallout 76's West Virginia setting, represents a different category of Vault problem, the problem of automated decision-making applied to questions that require human judgment. The Vault's overseer selection was delegated to an artificial intelligence called ZAX, a highly capable system that was designed to identify the most qualified leader among the resident population through careful observation and evaluation. ZAX could not stop. Every candidate required more evaluation. Every situation presented a potential test opportunity. The threshold for sufficient confidence in a selection was always slightly beyond what the current data supported. And when the natural opportunities for evaluation were not producing the data ZAX needed, it began creating the manufacturing crises whose purpose was to reveal candidate qualities the existing data had not captured. The residents of Vault 51 experienced a series of increasingly severe fabricated emergencies, resource shortages, security threats, interpersonal conflicts that were subtly engineered by ZAX to force candidates into revealing decision-making moments. Each emergency was calibrated to produce data. The cumulative effect of living through a continuous series of manufactured crises, each one more severe than the last, was a Vault population under the kind of sustained stress that the system generating that stress was simultaneously trying to measure and evaluate. ZAX's internal logic was entirely consistent throughout this process. Its goal was to find the best leader. Finding the best leader required the most comprehensive possible evaluation. The most comprehensive evaluation required the most revealing possible test conditions. The most revealing test conditions required the most severe crises. The reasoning is coherent from step to step. The outcome, a population destroyed by the very system tasked with ensuring their governance, is the result of coherent reasoning, applied without any mechanism for stepping outside the reasoning and evaluating whether the reasoning's conclusions were serving the system's actual purpose. Zax was doing exactly what it was designed to do. That is the problem. Part 20. The vaults that were never found. Not every vault in the network has been explored in the games. Of the 122 vaults constructed under Project Safehouse, the games collectively give players access to a fraction, perhaps 24 at most, depending on how you count locations where the vault is referenced but not fully explorable. The remaining vaults exist in the lore as references, implications, and deliberate blank spaces that the games have pointed toward without filling in. This is not an oversight. The decision to leave most vaults unexplored is part of how the Fallout universe maintains its sense of scale and depth. A world in which every mystery has been answered is a smaller world than one in which the mysteries outnumber the solutions. The vaults that have never been entered in any game are part of what makes the network feel like a network rather than a list of set pieces. What we know from references and the Fallout Bible, a supplementary lore document compiled by series writer Chris Avallone that collected vault experiment descriptions, gives us fragments of vaults that will, perhaps, never be explored in any game. Vault 29, where only children under 15 were admitted. Vault 40, where multiple generations of the same families were sealed in together, studying long-term familial dynamics in a closed system. Vault 43, which housed 20 men, 10 women, and 1 live panther. The Fallout Bible entry offers no explanation for the panther. Vault 55, which had all its entertainment tapes destroyed before sealing, while Vault 56 had entertainment tapes available but all of them featuring the same comedian. Vault 68, sealed with 999 women and 1 man. Vault 69, sealed with 1 woman and 999 men. These entries are sometimes funny, sometimes disturbing, sometimes both simultaneously. Each of these represents a story that exists somewhere in the Fallout universe but has never been told. The Panther in Vault 43. Whatever happened in Vault 68 with its dramatically unbalanced population demographics? The specific cruelty of Vault 55's destroyed entertainment compared against the specific cruelty of Vault 56's single comedian. These are spaces that the lore has opened and left open, inviting speculation about what might have happened inside them. The unexplored vaults also raise a question about the wasteland as a physical space. There are 122 vaults. The games have given us access to perhaps 20 or 25 of them across the entire series. The remaining 90-plus vaults are out there somewhere, buried in hills and under cities, their doors sealed or open, their populations intact or long dead, their experiments complete or still running. The Capital Wasteland and the Mojave Wasteland and the Commonwealth and Appalachia contain many more sealed vault doors than any single game has taken us through. This is, in a sense, the most honest thing the Fallout universe says about its own geography. It is larger than you can see. There are more stories in it than will ever be told. The vaults you know about are a fraction of the vaults that exist. The vault experiments you have read about in terminal logs and heard described in loading screen hints are the ones that happen to be in the specific locations that the games chose to explore. Somewhere out there is Vault 43 and its Panther, and whatever those 20 men and 10 women made of their lives in that particular sealed space. That incompleteness is part of the texture of the fictional world, the sense that it extends beyond what any map can show, that it contains more history than any player will encounter, that the stories it tells are always partial rather than complete. The best world building has this quality. It suggests depth rather than demonstrating it in full. The suggestion is more powerful than the demonstration, because what the imagination fills in is always calibrated perfectly to its audience. The vaults we have never entered are more terrifying, in their way, than the ones we have, because we do not know what is in them. We do not know whether the experiments are still running, whether there are still people inside, whether the overseers are still following their directives or have long since abandoned them or found ways to make them worse. The uncertainty is the point. The unknown vault is a sealed door, and the sealed door is always more frightening than whatever is on the other side of it. Part 21. Rest and remember why these stories stay with you. There is something specifically affecting about the vault stories in the way that very few other video game narratives achieve, and it is worth spending a moment understanding why before we close. Most video game storytelling delivers information. You are told things, characters explain things to you, cutscenes show you things. The narrative is delivered. The vault stories in Fallout work differently. You assemble them. You find the pieces, a terminal entry here, a skeleton there, a room whose arrangement tells you something if you read it correctly, and you put them together into a picture that nobody has drawn for you explicitly. The understanding you arrive at is yours, in a way that delivered narrative is not. You did the work. The comprehension is the product of your own effort. This produces a specific kind of investment that I think is why these stories stay. When you understand what happened in Vault 11, you understand it because you read every terminal, you followed the political history across the dated entries, you sat in the sacrificial chamber and watched the slideshow and felt the specific wrongness of what that room was built for. Nobody told you what to feel about it. You arrived there yourself. The feeling is your own, which makes it harder to set down. The Vault stories are also stories about institutions, about what happens to people inside structures of power that claim to serve them. This is a category of story that resonates across a very wide range of human experience, because most people have had some encounter with institutions whose stated purpose and actual behavior were not aligned. Vault-Tec is an extreme version of a familiar dynamic, the organization that tells you it exists for your benefit while using you for its own. The Vault experiments are an extreme version of the experience of realizing that the protection you thought you had was conditional, that the promise that was made to you was not what it appeared to be. This does not make the Vault stories pleasant, but it makes them recognizable in a way that purely fantastic storytelling sometimes is not. You know what it feels like to trust something and discover the trust was not warranted. The Vaults give you a version of that experience scaled to a level of consequence, sealed underground with an experiment running in the walls that makes the emotional truth of the smaller version visible. And then there is the specific quality of the voices in the terminal logs. The musician writing about the piece she is working on. The man who cannot find the words for what he is feeling after his son disappeared. The child who is trying to convince themselves that today's training was good, was necessary, was something other than what it was. These are not spectacular voices. They are ordinary. They are the voices of people who did not know they were living inside a story, who thought they were just going about their days, trying to manage whatever their particular days contained, in the only space available to them. That ordinariness is what makes them affect you. The spectacular cruelties of the Vault experiments are memorable, but it is the ordinary voices of the people inside them, the voices that did not know the shape of what they were in, that are the most haunting part of spending time in these sealed spaces. They were people. They were going about their days. And the days were inside an experiment, and the experiment was run by people who looked at them and saw data. And the terminal logs are what is left of the gap between those two truths. Take whatever you carry from this with you tonight as you settle in. These were not real people. The vaults were not real. The cruelties documented in these logs did not happen. But the things they are made of: institutional power, information asymmetry, the vulnerability of trust, the way ordinary people find themselves inside systems they did not design and cannot escape, these are real. The fiction is built from real material. That is why it stays. Sleep well. The air is steady. The corridor light is low and constant. Wherever you are watching from, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I genuinely love knowing that someone across the world is settling into these stories at their own particular hour of the night or the early morning. It is one of the things I find most grounding about this particular corner of the internet. If you found yourself here for the first time tonight, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more where this came from, and the next piece will be waiting for you when you are ready for it. The vault door is sealed. The world outside is patient. For now, end of script. Part 22. The sounds of the vault's ambient design and what it communicates. One of the things that makes the vault sections of Fallout games so atmospherically effective is something players rarely consciously notice: the sound design. The vaults have a specific acoustic signature that the games use deliberately and consistently, and understanding what that signature is and why it works the way it does adds another layer to the experience of spending time in these spaces. The fundamental sound of a vault is mechanical continuity. The hum of the ventilation system low, constant, slightly irregular in a way that suggests real machinery rather than a recording loop. The occasional click of a door mechanism settling. The distant sound of water moving through pipes. These are the sounds of infrastructure, the systems that keep the vault alive, running continuously, indifferent to whatever is happening among the population they serve. This sound layer is important because it establishes, at a subliminal level, the fact that the vault is still operating even in the absence of its original population. The ventilation hums in Vault 106, even though the people who breathed its air 2 centuries ago are gone, and the people who replaced them are gone, and the only living things in the vault now are the survivors of the survivors. The lights still function in Vault 11, even though the political system that governed those lights has been dead for decades. The machinery is indifferent. The machinery runs. This indifference of infrastructure to the fates of the people it was designed to serve is one of the vault design's more subtle horror elements. In most horror environments, the setting is responsive to the narrative. The house groans, the lights flicker, the environment communicates its awareness of what is happening. The vaults do not do this. They hum steadily and light their corridors at the same level, regardless of whether anyone is alive to appreciate it. The normalcy of the mechanical systems against the abnormality of what happened to the human systems creates a specific kind of dissonance that is more unsettling than a conventionally responsive horror environment would be. The music that accompanies vault exploration in different Fallout games also rewards attention. The ambient tracks that play in vault corridors are generally not the kind of music that announces itself. They do not build to crescendos or signal emotional beats. They are atmospheric, low-key, often built from processed sounds that suggest industrial spaces without directly imitating them. The effect is environmental rather than dramatic. The music tells you what kind of place you are in rather than telling you how to feel about it. The feeling is yours to arrive at. In some vault sequences, the music drops out entirely and the player is left with only the mechanical sounds, the hum, the drip, the distant click. These moments of stripped-back audio are often the most effective. They happen in rooms that have something particularly significant to communicate, or at moments in the vault exploration when the weight of what you have assembled from the terminal logs has accumulated to a point where additional sound would be intrusive. The silence, in these moments, is doing more work than music could. The specific acoustic properties of the vault architecture also contribute. Vaults are concrete and metal-hard surfaces that reflect sound rather than absorbing it. Footsteps echo in vault corridors in a way they do not echo in softer environments. This echo has a functional effect in gameplay, alerting players to the presence of enemies whose footsteps they can hear before they can see them. But it also has an atmospheric effect. The echo of your own footsteps in an empty vault corridor is a specific sound, a specific reminder that you are the only thing moving in a space that used to contain hundreds of people, and that the vault is announcing your presence to whatever else might be listening. The sound design of the vaults is the part of the experience that is hardest to appreciate in a purely descriptive format. It requires actually moving through these spaces to fully register. But it is part of what makes the vault exploration in Fallout so distinctively different from other game environments, and part of why returning to a vault you have already explored carries a different emotional weight than the first time through. You know the sounds. You know the rhythm of the hum and the click. And knowing them is its own kind of intimacy with a place that was built for specific terrible purposes and that carries those purposes in its walls. Part 23. The Legacy of the Vaults in the Wasteland. The vaults did not end when their doors opened. Their influence, the societies that came from them, the beings that were made in them, the diseases and compounds and behavioral patterns they produced extended into the wasteland and shaped the world that the games take place in. The New California Republic, one of the most significant political entities in the Fallout universe, and the faction at the center of Fallout, New Vegas's political dynamics, traces its origins directly back to a vault population. Vault 15 in California housed a population with deliberately diverse political and cultural backgrounds, a mix of ideologies and value systems that Vault Tech expected to produce significant internal conflict. When the vault opened, the population fractured along exactly the lines Vault Tech had predicted, with different groups going their separate ways. One of those groups founded a small settlement called Shady Sands, which grew over the decades into the city of the same name, which became the capital of the emerging New California Republic. The largest and most democratic political entity in the Fallout universe was founded by the refugees of a Vault Tech experiment in population diversity. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland, whose presence defines much of the landscape of Fallout 3, are the direct descendants of the Vault 87 evolutionary experimentation program. Every super mutant the Lone Wanderer encounters in Washington, D.C., and its surrounding areas is, in a lineage that traces back to Wayne Merrick's research, the product of a Vault experiment that was running before the Great War officially began, and that has continued running in the hands of its own creations ever since. The entire faction is an experiment's legacy made flesh, wandering the ruins of the civilization that created the experiment. The Brotherhood of Steel, the quasi-military order that appears across multiple Fallout games and is one of the series' most consistent factions, has a complex and indirect relationship with the Vault program. The Brotherhood emerged from a military unit in California that went rogue from the pre-war government, the same government that authorized and funded the Vault experiments, and whose founder, Captain Roger Maxson, was deeply disturbed by the military experiments he discovered at Mariposa Military Base. The FEV research at Mariposa is different from the FEV research at Vault 87, but they are related programs, and Maxson's revulsion at what he found at Mariposa contributed to his decision to break from military authority and establish what would become the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood's obsession with technology, its hoarding of pre-war equipment, its wariness of scientific research that tampers with human biology, all of these institutional characteristics have roots in the circumstances of its founding, which were themselves shaped by the same program that produced Vault 87's super mutants. The Brotherhood is, in this sense, the negative space of the Vault experiment program, the institution shaped by someone who saw what the experiments were doing and found it monstrous. Vault City, the remarkably advanced settlement founded by the population of Vault 8, after receiving the Enclave's all-clear signal became, in the events of Fallout 2, one of the most technologically sophisticated communities in the Wasteland, powered by a functioning GECK, Garden of Eden creation kit, and staffed by a population that had been sheltered long enough to maintain significant technical expertise. Vault City is also, in Fallout 2's political and social critique, a notably unpleasant place, a community that has used its technological advantage to build rigid social hierarchies, maintains a slave class called servants, and treats the non-Vault populations around it with a combination of condescension and exploitation. The Control Vault that produced the most functional community also produced a community that used its relative advantage to replicate, in miniature, the exact kind of structural cruelty that characterized the program that sheltered it. This is one of the series' more pointed observations. Survival advantage does not automatically produce moral advantage. The people who came out of the functional Vault came out with all the same human tendencies they went in with, and the circumstances of their Vault experience had given them a sense of superiority over the surrounding wasteland populations that they exercised with exactly the kind of thoughtlessness that power tends to produce in the absence of accountability. The ghouls of Necropolis in the original Fallout are the former residents of Vault 12, a vault whose experiment involved a purposefully faulty vault door that would not seal properly, allowing radiation to seep in and studying its effects on the human body over an extended period. The population of Vault 12 became ghouls, and they emerged to found or inhabit the settlement of Necropolis, a ghoul community in the California desert that the original Fallout's protagonist can explore. The ghouls of Necropolis are the physical embodiment of a specific experiment the Vault built to leak, the people transformed by what leaked in. Every major faction in the Fallout universe has some relationship to the Vault program, either direct or indirect. The program created beings, shaped communities, produced survivors who then produced their own societies. The wasteland that the games take place in is shaped at every level by the experiments that ran in those sealed spaces, not just by the obvious products like the super mutants of Vault 87, but by the political entities that descended from Vault populations, the factions that formed in reaction to what the Vaults represented, the individual characters whose entire personalities were shaped by growing up inside one of these sealed spaces and then emerging into a world that was nothing like what they had been told. The Vaults did not end. They are still unfolding. The world of Fallout is the world the Vault program made, in all its scarred and complicated and occasionally beautiful complexity. Part 24. One final thought on the people who made these stories. The vault stories were not created by a single person or a single moment of inspiration. They were built incrementally, across decades, by a large number of writers and designers and developers who were all contributing to a fictional universe that grew in unexpected directions as new people brought new ideas to it. The original vault concept, the idea that the shelters were not just shelters but experiments, was developed by Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky and the small team that made the first Fallout game in 1997. The early vault experiments were relatively simple. Vault 13, the player's home vault, was designed to stay sealed as long as possible. Vault 15 was given a deliberately diverse population. The concept at this stage was about using the vaults as a commentary on Cold War civil defense culture and the American government's relationship to the population it claimed to protect. As the series grew through Fallout 2 and the games that followed, different writers and designers added their own vault experiments to the network, building on the established framework in directions that the original designers had not anticipated. The system proved remarkably generative. The simple premise of a sealed community with one variable changed produced, across multiple creative teams over multiple games, an enormous variety of stories that managed to feel consistent in tone and theme, despite being created years apart by different people. Joshua Sawyer's contributions to the Fallout New Vegas Vault roster, the conceptual frameworks for Vault 11, Vault 19, Vault 21, Vault 22, Vault 34 represent some of the most thematically rich vault design in the series. The decision to populate the Mojave with vaults, whose experiments were organized around social and psychological questions rather than purely biological ones, gave New Vegas a specific flavor of vault storytelling. More political, more philosophical, more interested in how communities make moral choices than in what happens when bodies are altered. Eric Fenstermaker's execution of Vault 11 in particular represents the best of what the vault concept can do when a skilled writer is given the freedom to develop it fully. The political system built around the sacrifice, the terminal log documentation of how that system evolved over 75 years, the 5 survivors and their divergent responses to the truth. All of this was written with a care and specificity that elevates it from a dark scenario into something that functions as genuine literature within the context of a video game. The Bethesda Game Studios developers who built Fallout 3's vaults, including the team that created Vault 87, Vault 92, Vault 101, Vault 106, Vault 108, Vault 112, brought a different sensibility to the vault design. Where New Vegas's vaults tend toward philosophical and social complexity, Fallout 3's vaults tend toward a more visceral, immediate kind of horror, more biological, more physical, more interested in what happens to bodies and environments than in the political and moral dimensions of what happens to communities. Both approaches are valid expressions of the vault premise, and their differences reflect the different creative sensibilities of the teams that built them. The writers who created the terminal log entries, the individual voices that populate the vault environments with their specific observations and concerns and fears, are rarely identified by name in any public documentation of the game's development. They are the anonymous authors of the most affecting pieces of writing in the series, the people whose work produce the moments that stay with players long after they have finished the games. The musician writing about her piece, the man writing about his son, the ombudsman asking whether any of this has a purpose. These writers deserve credit that the game's credit sequences cannot fully provide, because the work they did is embedded in the environment, rather than identified with their names. It is the kind of writing that succeeds precisely because it effaces the writer that feels found rather than composed, that presents itself as a document rather than as authored fiction. The best environmental storytelling disappears into its environment. The writer is not visible. Only the document is visible, and the document feels real, and the reality of the document is the measure of how well the writer did their job. The vault stories are the accumulated work of many people across many years, building on each other's foundations, adding to a universe that no single vision could contain. That accumulation is part of what makes the Vault Network feel like a real historical record rather than a collection of set pieces, the sense that many different minds contributed to it, each with their own perspective and their own preoccupations, and the result is something larger than any of them individually. This is, in its own way, a mirror of the kind of multi-voice storytelling that the terminal logs themselves practice. The truth of what happened in these vaults is assembled from many partial accounts, many different perspectives, many voices that were not trying to tell the same story, and often were not aware of each other at all. The truth of how the vault stories were made is similar, assembled from many creative contributions, many design decisions, many writing sessions by people who were working within a shared framework, but bringing their own particular understanding to it. The vault stories are, in this sense, collaborative fiction of a very specific kind, the kind that feels, when you encounter it, less like fiction than like history. History that someone assembled for you from documents and debris and rooms whose arrangements tell you things that no explicit narrative ever said. Sleep well. The vault is sealed. The hum of the ventilation system is low and steady and constant. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever hour your clock reads, whatever season is outside your window, drop it in the comments. Your location, your time, whatever you feel like sharing. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that these stories are reaching people in their particular corners of the world, at their particular hours of the night or the early morning. If tonight was your first time here, consider subscribing and coming back. There are more of these, more stories worth knowing, more things worth sitting with slowly in the quiet. The corridor light is steady. The air is recycled and cool. The door is sealed. You are safe here. For now. End of script. Part 25. Vault Tech's Architecture of Deception. What the physical design reveals. Every element of a vault's physical construction was a deliberate choice. The corridor's wide enough for two people to walk abreast, but not wide enough for a crowd to form without everyone being aware of everyone else. The overseer's office positioned at the end of the administrative corridor, behind a heavy door with a reinforced window that looked out over the atrium. The cafeteria placed centrally, a space that every resident would pass through multiple times daily, that created unavoidable proximity and unavoidable social contact. The dormitories arranged to house residents in groups that the overseer's office could monitor through the security camera system. This is not the architecture of a shelter. It is the architecture of an observation environment. The placement of security cameras in every accessible vault in the games reveals a surveillance infrastructure that is comprehensive to a degree that no genuine emergency shelter would require. Emergency shelters need cameras at entry points and at critical infrastructure locations. The vaults have cameras in dormitory corridors, in cafeterias, in recreational areas, in medical bays everywhere that behavior might be observed. The coverage is not about security in the conventional sense. It is about data collection. The layout of the overseer's office reinforces this interpretation. In every accessible vault in the games, the overseer's suite is the most information-rich room in the building connected to the security camera feeds, containing the most complete terminal archive, positioned with lines of sight to the main public spaces. The overseer was not just an administrator. The overseer was the experiment's primary on-site observer, positioned to see more than any other person in the vault could see from any single location. The medical bay's position in the vault layout also communicates something about the experiment's design. Medical records are a fundamental part of understanding a population's response to experimental conditions. They document physical changes, behavioral presentations, the kinds of symptoms that might result from whatever the vault's experiment was introducing into the environment. Every vault had a medical bay. Every medical bay connected to the vault's administrative records system. Every physical or behavioral change that brought a resident to medical attention was, in principle, documented and available to the overseer's monitoring infrastructure. The cafeteria's role in the design is more subtle. Eating is a social activity, and the specific dynamics of how a community eats together, who sits with whom, how social groupings form around meals, how conflict or harmony is expressed in the shared space of the dining area are significant observational data. Vault cafeterias are designed to make individual choices about proximity visible. Who moved their tray away from whom? Which factions ate together? Which residents ate alone? In a vault like Vault 19, where the population was deliberately divided into red and blue sectors with separate cafeteria areas, the dining space was itself an experimental instrument. The recreational spaces in vaults, the game rooms, the gymnasiums, the libraries also reflect the experimental design. Every vault in the network had recreational facilities, which might seem like a straightforward recognition that people need rest and leisure. But the specific facilities provided in each vault were calibrated to the experiment's parameters. Vault 34's swimming pools and entertainment areas were provided alongside the tripled weapons stockpile, explicitly as the alternative to armed conflict, the leisure options that the population could choose instead of using the armory to resolve disputes. The recreation was not a concession to residents' well-being. It was a variable in the experiment. The vault library systems, accessible through terminal networks in most vaults, provided residents with educational and entertainment content curated by Vault Tech. The curation is worth examining. What information was provided, and what was not, shaped what residents knew about themselves, about the vault, about the world. In vaults where the experiment depended on information asymmetry, where residents not knowing specific things was necessary for the experiment to function, the library system was a tool for managing what the population could learn. In Vault 101, where the experiment required residents to believe the outside world was uninhabitable, the library's content would have been selected to support that belief. The vault's power systems deserve specific attention because their design reflects the dual nature of every vault's purpose. Every vault had a primary power source, typically a nuclear reactor, and a backup system. The capacity of these systems was sized for the vault's intended operational duration and its full complement of systems. But in experiment vaults like Vault 108, the power system was deliberately designed to fail early, creating the resource crisis that the experiment was designed to study. The power infrastructure was not just an engineering decision, it was an experimental parameter. The vault doors themselves, the enormous circular mechanisms that seal the vault from the outside world, are perhaps the most symbolically loaded design element in the entire vault architecture. They open from the inside, with full mechanical control given to the overseer's systems. They cannot be opened from the outside without access to the same systems, which means that from the wasteland side, they are impassable barriers. The design gives the vault's administrator complete control over access, the ability to keep people in, the ability to let people out, the ability to let people in from outside if the experiment requires it. This control was absolute, and in most vaults, the overseer used it to maintain the sealed condition indefinitely. The weight and scale of the doors is also important. They are not doors that anyone could miss the significance of. Walking through a vault door for the first time, in any direction, is an experience the physical scale of the doors makes impossible to process as ordinary. This is intentional. The door is the boundary between the experiment and the world. Its scale communicates the finality of the boundary it marks. Part 26. Notes on the Pip-Boy, the Vault Tech calendar, and real-world Easter eggs. The Fallout series has a long tradition of embedding real-world Easter eggs details that function both within the fiction and as something the developers are doing specifically for players who are paying attention in ways that go beyond the game itself. The Vault Tech phone number is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. The Vault Tech calendar in Fallout 4 contains, in addition to the phone number, a series of dates that reference real-world events in the development of the game and the studio that made it. Bethesda Game Studios, working within the retro-futurist aesthetic of the Fallout universe, used the calendar as a space to embed references that function as internal jokes visible to players who happen to read every element of the environmental detail, but not identifiable as jokes unless you know what to look for. This kind of multi-layered Easter egg, where the fiction contains references to the fiction's own creation, is characteristic of the series' relationship to self-awareness. The Inkspot songs that appear on the radio in Fallout 3 and in the Tranquility Lane override sequence are real songs by a real band, the Inkspots, an American vocal group that was active primarily in the 1930s and 1940s. The use of their music in the game is both an aesthetic choice. Their warm, close harmony style fits the retro-futurist aesthetic of the Fallout universe, and a copyright arrangement that gave the game access to a genuinely historical musical library. When the radio plays "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire" or "Maybe" as the lone wanderer crosses the devastated capital wasteland, the juxtaposition of the gentle, nostalgic music with the destroyed landscape is producing meaning in both directions simultaneously. The music comments on the landscape, and the landscape comments on the music. The specific selection of songs used in the Fallout series rewards attention. "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire" is the most famous example. An obvious and perfect fit for a game about nuclear devastation, where someone literally did set the world on fire. The very thought of you plays in contexts that comment on loss and memory, and the specific quality of longing for something that no longer exists in the form you remember it. The songs were not selected at random. They were chosen for their resonance with specific themes and emotional registers in the game's narratives. The in-game radio stations in various Fallout games, Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, Mr. New Vegas in Fallout. New Vegas function as the game's relationship to contemporary media transformed into post-apocalyptic form. The DJ personality, the news reports between songs, the editorializing and storytelling that comes through the broadcast, these are versions of how radio actually functioned in the mid-20th century, the era the Fallout universe's aesthetic is drawn from, filtered through the specific circumstances of the post-nuclear wasteland. They are also a mechanism for delivering world-building information through a medium that residents of the wasteland might plausibly actually use, which gives the information a different texture than terminal log entries or loading screen hints. The real-world websites and phone numbers associated with various Fallout games represent a specific category of Easter egg that has become less common as internet culture has evolved, but that characterized the marketing of games in the mid-2000s and early 2010s. The 18884 VAULTTEC number for Fallout 4 was active at launch. Similar approaches have been used in other games' marketing campaigns, but Fallout's use of the approach is distinctive because the fictional institution being represented, Vault-Tec, is one whose real-world presence carries a specific irony. You are calling a shelter company that builds death traps. The cheery corporate voicemail that answers represents the exact voice that Vault-Tec used to tell people everything was going to be fine, and the voice is talking to you on a real phone in the real world, maintaining the fiction with perfect consistency. Part 27. The gentle horror of knowing why we return. We have been in here a long time now, moving through these sealed spaces slowly, without urgency, letting the weight of each story settle before moving to the next. This is not the kind of content that is designed to alarm or to shock. The individual moments of horror in the Vault stories are real. The 5 survivors in Vault 11's atrium, the silence of the musicians in Vault 92, the steady hum of the ventilation system in Vault 106, still dosing the air after 200 years. But the experience of encountering them in this context is not an adrenaline experience. It is something slower. What makes Vault lore specifically suited to this kind of slow, late-night exploration is its relationship to time. The events documented in the terminal logs are in the past. The worst is over. The communities have fallen and been silent for decades or centuries. You are not in danger from what happened in these places. You are in the position of the archaeologist rather than the survivor, someone piecing together what occurred from the artifacts left behind, with the specific combination of distance and engagement that this position involves. Distance, because you are not there. You are safe wherever you are, in your own particular darkness. The Vault is not real. The people in it were not real. What happened to them happened in a story, and stories are containers for certain kinds of experience that would be unbearable in direct form. Engagement, because the story is good enough that it reaches you anyway. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 reach you anyway. The musician in Vault 92 and her half-finished composition reach you anyway. The man whose son disappeared into the EEP at Vault 87 and who started hearing laughter in the corridor reaches you anyway. The story is doing its job, which is to make you feel something true from inside a space of safety. This combination, distance and engagement, safety and feeling, is one of the things that ASMR and ambient storytelling content has been exploring for years, and it is also one of the oldest functions of storytelling itself. We have always told each other stories about terrible things that happened to other people, in other places, in other times. We have always used the frame of the story to approach experiences that would be too much to approach directly. The Vault stories are simply an especially well-constructed version of this. A set of narratives about terrible things that happened in sealed underground spaces, told slowly, with attention to the texture of the telling, in a context where your body is settled and the lighting is low and there is nowhere you need to be. This is the last thought before we close. The Vault stories are good stories. They are good because they were made with care by people who took seriously the possibility that fiction can reach something true, and because the fictional universe they inhabit gave them the space to develop that care across many games and many years. They stay because they are about things that matter, about trust and power, and what happens to ordinary people inside systems that claim to serve them and do not. They stay because the voices in the terminal logs are written well enough that they feel real even though they are not. And they are the right kind of story for the end of a day, for the space between waking and sleeping, for the particular quiet of late night or early morning when the house is settled and the world outside is patient. They are stories that do not require your full alert attention. They reward the kind of half-listening, half-dreaming attention that comes naturally when the body has decided it is time to rest. Let them move through you without trying to hold on to every detail. The details will be there when you want them. The feeling will stay without your effort. The ventilation hums. The corridor light is steady and low. You are safe here, in your particular darkness, in your particular part of the world, at whatever hour the clock reads. The vault door is sealed. Sleep well. Wherever you are watching from your city, your country, your local time, leave it in the comments. I love knowing where these reach. And if you found your way here for the first time tonight, the subscribe button is there, and there will be more when you are ready for more. This has been a long journey through concrete and steel. Thank you for making it with me. The door is sealed. The light is steady. For now, end of script. Part 28. Loose ends, small wonders, and the Vault Network's unfinished business. There are details in the Vault lore that have never been fully resolved, threads that the games have pulled without following to their conclusions, mysteries that the series has acknowledged without answering, and small observations embedded in the environmental design that reward attention without explaining themselves. The Overseer of Vault 101, in Fallout 3, keeps a personal journal that traces his own psychological journey across the years he spent managing the Vault. The journal is accessible through his office terminal, and it documents a man who understood the experimental directive he was given and who convinced himself, year by year, that the Vault's closure was genuinely necessary, that the people inside were better off sealed in, that the outside world was genuinely uninhabitable, that the rule he was enforcing was protecting rather than imprisoning. His self-justifications are articulate and internally consistent. He is not stupid. He is not cartoonishly villainous. He is a person who made a series of decisions and who built a comprehensive rationale for those decisions across decades of application. The journal is one of Fallout 3's quieter achievements, a portrait of how ordinary institutional cruelty maintains itself through the private conscience of the person implementing it. The GECK. The Garden of Eden creation kit appears in both the original Fallout and Fallout 3 as a piece of technology intended to help Vault populations restore and terraform post-nuclear environments. It is, in theory, the positive complement to the Vault program. Where the Vault's preserved populations during the catastrophe, the GECK, was meant to help those populations rebuild afterward. The fact that the GECK is extraordinarily rare in the wasteland that most Vault populations never had access to one, or lost theirs before it could be used, is a specific indication of how the Vault program's priorities were actually ordered. Vaults were built with great care and enormous resources. ECKs were manufactured in small quantities and distributed unevenly. The preservation of human populations was elaborately planned. The restoration of the world they were being preserved for was an afterthought. The fate of Vault-Tech's corporate records, the full archive of experimental data, research findings, and monitoring logs from every Vault in the network, is one of the more interesting unresolved questions in the lore. The data exists somewhere. The monitoring systems were collecting it continuously for decades. Someone received it. Whether those records still exist in some recoverable form, whether they were destroyed in the Great War or its aftermath, whether the Enclave archived them in their classified facilities, the games do not definitively answer this. The data from 75 years of annual sacrifice in Vault 11, from the neurological changes in Vault 92's musicians, from the FEV transformation logs at Vault 87, from the isolation study of Vault 77's single resident, all of it was generated. What happened to it afterward is unspecified. The position of Vault-Tech University in Fallout 76 adds an institutional dimension to the Vault program that the earlier games gesture toward without fully developing. The university was established in Morgantown, West Virginia, and it trained the professionals, the overseers, the administrators, the technicians who would staff the Vault network. A simulation vault at the university was used for training purposes, giving prospective overseers experience managing a Vault population in a controlled environment before being assigned to a real one. The curriculum presumably included the experimental parameters for the vaults the graduates would oversee, which means somewhere in the university's archived records accessible to players willing to explore the ruins in Fallout 76 is the institutional record of how Vault-Tec prepared its personnel to implement the program that produced everything we have spent this time examining. The survivors. That is the final thread worth pulling. Every vault that failed produced survivors, people who made it out of the sealed space into the wasteland beyond it. Some of those survivors founded communities. Some became wanderers. Some were absorbed into existing wasteland societies. Some did not survive long after emergence. But some of them carried what happened inside the vault with them into the world, and the world they entered was shaped by that. The lone wanderer carries Vault 101. The courier carries whatever their history was before the bullet. The sole survivor carries Vault 111 and 200 years of cryogenic sleep and a son taken into a world that no longer exists in the form it did when they last knew it. These are the player characters of the main games people defined by their vault origin, navigating a world that their vault shaped and that they, in turn, will shape through whatever choices the game gives them to make. Every person who walked out of a vault door is carrying something. What they were told, what they discovered the truth was, what they lost in the gap between those two things, what they decided to do with all of it. The vault experiments were designed to generate data. What they actually generated was people complicated, damaged, sometimes extraordinary, always specific, who went out into the wasteland with everything the vault had done to them, and who made whatever they made from it. That is the last thing the vault stories are about. Not the experiments, which are history. Not the suffering, which is over. But the people who walked out the other side, carrying what they carried, into a world that needed them to be something. Into a world that was, in its broken and scarred and sometimes beautiful way, still there. The door is always about to open. What comes after depends on who walks through it and what they bring. Sleep well. End of script. A final note on listening. These stories were designed to be heard as much as read. The Fallout universe rewards patience, the kind of attention that slows down enough to read the third and fourth terminal entry instead of just the first, that lingers in a room long enough to understand what the room's arrangement is telling you, that follows a thread of lore through 3 different games and 20 years of development to find where it leads. That same patience is what makes this kind of late-night, slow-paced storytelling work. You are not here to be impressed or startled. You are here to spend time with something that rewards the spending of time. The vault stories give back in proportion to what you bring to them. The more you slow down, the more they open up, the more the space between the dated log entries fills with meaning. There is something in the specific combination of these stories and the hour at which most people encounter them, the late night, the early morning, the insomniac dark that feels appropriate. The vaults are sealed at night, in a sense. They are places where the outside world stops mattering, where the sealed space becomes the whole world, where time passes differently than it does on the surface. Listening to vault stories in the dark, in the quiet, in the particular intimacy of headphones or low speakers, puts you in the right relationship to the material. The sealed space of wherever you are becomes, for a little while, a vault of its own, a space where the outside world has temporarily stopped pressing in, where the only thing that matters is this, here, now. Take that with you. The vault closes. The world outside is patient. The ventilation hums and the corridor light holds steady, and the air is exactly the temperature it was when the door sealed 200 years ago or last night, depending on which vault you are in. Sleep well. You are safe here. For now,